Douglas Pike referred to the Battle of An Loc during the North Vietnamese Spring Offensive of 1972 as the single most important battle in the Vietnam War. Starting in April, an intense conflict erupted between three North Vietnamese Army divisions and the significantly outnumbered South Vietnamese defenders. This nearly three-month siege led to devastating losses on both sides and ended with the North Vietnamese being halted in their advance toward Saigon. It marked the last major confrontation where U.S. support, mainly through advisors and air assistance, was available to the South Vietnamese forces. Throughout the battle, the besieged South Vietnamese defenders managed to withstand a relentless North Vietnamese assault of an intensity rarely seen in the Vietnam War. After the fierce fighting subsided, the city remained in South Vietnamese control. With various South Vietnamese ground combat units involved, the battle offers a unique chance to evaluate their combat performance under severe wartime conditions. The North Vietnamese Spring Offensive of 1972 was a coordinated three-pronged attack aimed at delivering a decisive blow to the South Vietnamese government and military. The attackers utilized conventional strategies while introducing advanced weaponry not previously seen in any communist offensive in South Vietnam. As revealed by captured documents and information from NVA prisoners of war, the campaign aimed to eliminate as many ARVN forces as possible, allowing the North Vietnamese to seize key cities and position themselves to threaten Saigon and the Chio government. The communist offensive commenced on Good Friday, March 30th, 1972, when three NVA divisions under the B-5 front launched an attack south across the demilitarized zone toward Quang Tri and Hue. Additional North Vietnamese troops, directed by the B-3 front, advanced on Con Tum in the Central Highlands. Just 3 days later, three more NVA divisions, operating under B-2 front headquarters, entered Bin Long Province in Military Region 3. In total, 14 NVA divisions and 26 separate regiments, comprising over 120,000 soldiers and around 1,200 tanks and armored vehicles, were involved in this offensive, known as the Nguyen Hue campaign. The enemy's coordinated attacks, marked by an intensity never before seen by South Vietnamese forces, began with significant successes, especially in the northern regions where the North Vietnamese army swiftly captured Quang Tri, nearly overwhelming the defending South Vietnamese troops. Additional communist forces posed threats to Hue and Con Tum. Military Region 3, consisting of the 11 provinces surrounding Saigon, sits snugly between the Central Highlands and the Mekong Delta. In the northwestern part of this region lies Bin Long Province, bordered to the west by Cambodia. The provincial capital, An Loc, with a population of around 15,000, is only 65 miles from Saigon. An Loc, encircled by expansive rubber plantations totaling 75,000 acres, is positioned along Route 13, a vital paved highway connecting Cambodia to the South Vietnamese capital. Due to its closeness to communist strongholds in Cambodia, the city had faced the harsh realities of war since the early 1960s. An Loc's strategic location along one of the primary attack routes from Cambodia to Saigon made it a key target in the North Vietnamese plan for 1972. At the onset of the NVA offensive, the 5th ARVN Infantry Division, under Brig Gen Le Van Hung, was the sole South Vietnamese division deployed in Bin Long Province. Before the battle for An Loc concluded, he would take command of Task Force 52, which included a 2-battalion task force from the 18th ARVN, the 3rd Ranger Group, the 74th Border Ranger Battalion, and local RF/PF troops. Furthermore, the 1st Airborne Brigade would be brought into Bin Long for a portion of the battle. By this point in the conflict, President Nixon had launched his Vietnamization program, aimed at shifting the responsibility of the war to the South Vietnamese forces. This initiative, first rolled out in 1969, sought to enhance ARVN capabilities and strengthen President Nguyen Van Thio's government so that South Vietnam could independently confront both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. Ultimately, bolstering ARVN capabilities would pave the way for the withdrawal of U.S. troops. A key element of the Vietnamization strategy was the increased advisory effort by Military Assistance Command Vietnam, the primary U.S. military headquarters in Vietnam, to elevate the quality of the ARVN forces. This program wasn't a new initiative. American advisors had been embedded with South Vietnamese units since 1955. However, as the number of American combat troops decreased, the significance of the advisory program grew. By 1972, most U.S. ground forces had pulled out, leaving only advisors who worked alongside ARVN units in combat roles. Advisors were present at the corps, division, and regimental levels, and in elite airborne, ranger, and marine units, there were Americans assigned to every battalion. Additionally, advisors were stationed at each South Vietnamese province and district headquarters. These advisors played a crucial role in the ARVN's defense against the North Vietnamese invasion. The Nguyen Hue Offensive kicked off in Military Region 3 on April 2nd, with the 24th and 271st NVA regiments launching attacks against the 25th ARVN Division's fire bases along the Cambodian border in Tay Ninh Province. Although earlier intelligence suggested the North Vietnamese were gearing up for operations in MR3, there was little indication that their actions would be as extensive as those seen in Quang Tri in MR1. The assaults in Tay Ninh, bolstered by tanks, rocket, and heavy mortar fire, seemed to align with prior expectations that any significant action in MR3 would emerge from that province. Consequently, while the South Vietnamese were taken aback by the intensity of the enemy assaults and the deployment of tanks, these attacks were still in line with their anticipations regarding MR3. In the 3 days following the North Vietnamese strikes in Tay Ninh, Binh Long Province experienced a period of relative calm. Senior U.S. advisors with the 5th ARVN Division noticed signs of increased enemy activity, but analysts at MACV in Saigon were convinced that the primary enemy effort would remain directed at Tay Ninh. They would soon find out they were mistaken. Then, at around 6:50 a.m. on April 5th, the conflict reached Binh Long Province, as a major tank-led assault targeted Loc Ninh, a district town situated on Route 13, roughly midway between An Loc and the Cambodian border. Lieutenant Nguyen Van Minh, the Three-Corps commander, along with Major Gen. James F. Thaddeus Hollingsworth, his American advisor, concluded that the attacks in Tay Ninh were merely a diversion and recognized that Binh Long was the actual focus of the North Vietnamese main effort. The generals provided all possible support to Binh Long. Loc Ninh was held by a small force of around 2,000 ARVN troops, mainly from the 9th Regiment of the 5th ARVN Division, along with 7 American advisors. The initial assault on the town was relentless, utilizing tanks and a significant amount of artillery, mortar, and rocket fire. Hollingsworth directed all available air support to help the beleaguered garrison. The American advisors in Loc Ninh skillfully coordinated these resources, inflicting heavy casualties on the attackers. Ultimately, however, the sheer number of enemy forces overwhelmed the defenders. Repeated wave assaults, backed by tanks and heavy artillery, led to the NVA overrunning the ARVN positions late in the afternoon of the 7th. While some ARVN soldiers and a few advisors managed to escape, the remaining South Vietnamese and American advisors were either killed or captured. The B-2 front plan to capture An Loc involved 3 NVA divisions and supporting units. By this stage of the war, many communist formations had taken on traditional North Vietnamese army characteristics, with these divisions primarily composed of North Vietnamese soldiers who had come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These units typically numbered between 7,000 and 9,000 troops. An additional 10,000 NVA soldiers in various support roles would also join the battle for An Loc. The North Vietnamese strategy assigned the elite 9th VC Division to attack An Loc directly. The 7th NVA Division was charged with blocking supplies and reinforcements from reaching An Loc via Route 13, south of the town, between Chon Than and Lai Khe. The 5th VC Division, which began the offensive in Binh Long by taking Loc Ninh, was to collaborate with the 9th VC Division in the assault on An Loc after securing Loc Ninh. As the battle progressed in Loc Ninh, the NVA also targeted an ARVN regimental-sized task force from the 18th ARVN Division, which was under the command of the 5th ARVN Division. This task force had been operating from 2 small fire bases situated between Loc Ninh and An Loc. The NVA forces successfully overran the ARVN positions, forced the survivors of the task force to retreat into An Loc. Shortly after Loc Ninh fell, the 9th VC Division initiated its attack on An Loc by capturing the airstrip at Quan Loi, only 3 kilometers to the northeast of the city. Meanwhile, to the south, the 1st ARVN Airborne Brigade, which had been transported by truck from Saigon to Bin Long, was ordered to head north along Route 13 from Lai Khe to bolster the An Loc garrison. Upon arrival, the airborne troops quickly encountered fierce resistance from the 7th NVA Division, which was well entrenched along the highway. It became evident that the North Vietnamese were intent on preventing any reinforcements or supplies from reaching An Loc by road. Losing Quan Loi airstrip and having QL-13 blocked meant An Loc was effectively surrounded and cut off from any external support. Thus began a siege that would last nearly 3 months. After taking Quan Loi, there was a brief pause in combat as the NVA readied themselves for the main assault on the city. By the afternoon of April 12th, the ARVN forces in and around the city had swelled to 9 infantry battalions, made up of regular troops from the 5th and 18th ARVN divisions, along with Rangers and territorial forces. Brigadier General Hung, commander of the 5th ARVN division, was put in charge of all South Vietnamese units in the city, numbering around 3,000 soldiers, who faced a daunting 6-1 disadvantage against the NVA forces encircling An Loc. The preparation for the initial NVA direct assault on An Loc kicked off in the early hours of April 13th, when North Vietnamese artillery opened fire on the city using a variety of guns, rockets, and mortars. Shortly after dawn, NVA forces launched a coordinated attack with tanks and infantry from the northeast. Soviet-made T-54 and PT-76 tanks advanced down the city's main north-south thoroughfare. Panic broke out among the ARVN defenders, who had never faced tanks in combat before. Some units faltered and fled. The tide began to turn slightly when an ARVN soldier succeeded in disabling one of the lead tanks with an M72 light anti-tank weapon, proving that infantry could indeed stop tanks. The battle raged for 3 days as the NVA pushed through house after house. Casualties mounted heavily on both sides, and the situation for the ARVN was precarious at best. After 3 days of intense fighting, the NVA had lost 23 tanks, but the ARVN defenders were pushed back into a small redoubt in the southern part of the city, which measured just 1,000 by 1,500 meters. The NVA controlled the northern section, with both sides often just a street apart. On multiple occasions, the attackers nearly captured Brigadier General Hung's command bunker for the 5th ARVN Division. American air support was crucial in stopping the initial North Vietnamese assault. Coordinated by U.S. advisors alongside ARVN troops in An Loc, various aircraft, including Air Force, Navy, and Marine fighters, ran operations in close coordination with the defenders engaging the NVA. Major General Hollingsworth also directed B-52 bombings against North Vietnamese staging areas nearby. This air support played a pivotal role during the intense battles of the first 3 days, preventing the outnumbered ARVN from facing near-certain defeat and establishing a pattern for the subsequent actions over the next 2 months. After 3 days, the intensity of the fighting lessened as the NVA's momentum waned from ongoing airstrikes. Yet the North Vietnamese continued to tighten their grip on An Loc, completely surrounding the city. In the first 3 days of the attack, they unleashed a staggering 25,000 artillery rounds and rockets, and the bombardment continued at a rate of 1,200 to 2,000 rounds daily over the following week as they prepared for another offensive. On April 16th, Lieutenant General Min, the 3 Corps commander, instructed the 1st Airborne Brigade to disengage along Route 13 and board helicopters for an assault on the high ground southeast of An Loc to bolster the city's defenses. That same day, Min received operational control of the 21st ARVN Division, previously stationed in the Mekong Delta. He directed the 21st to move to Lai Khe and take over the mission of the Airborne Brigade, pushing north along Route 13 to relieve An Loc. The initial NVA plan to overrun An Loc by April 20th did not succeed, as the main assault from the 9th VC Division was thwarted due to the effectiveness of American air support. The North Vietnamese had to revise their strategy and reposition their forces for a renewed attack. A new offensive was launched from the east. Once more, the 9th VC Division would spearhead the attack on the city, while the 5th VC and 7th NVA Divisions would target the positions of the 1st Airborne Brigade, situated southeast of An Loc. In an effort to counter American air support, the NVA brought in extra anti-aircraft weapons, including Soviet-made SA-7 Strela missiles and ZSU-57-2 self-propelled guns to protect their latest assault. The second significant attempt to seize An Loc began in the early hours of April 19th, marked by a massive artillery barrage hitting both the city and the 1st Airborne Brigade. This assault effectively overwhelmed one battalion and pushed two others back inside the city. However, the primary NVA push against the city faced greater resistance. The ARVN defenders, along with their advisors, fought valiantly against persistent ground attacks, utilizing close air support to unleash devastating fire upon the enemy's human wave assaults. Although the fighting was fierce, the air assistance enabled the defenders to repel the invaders. By April 20th, the intensity of the North Vietnamese attacks lessened somewhat. Nevertheless, the NVA kept bombarding the city with 100mm tank fire, rockets, and artillery shells. As the relentless shelling persisted, conditions in An Loc hit a new low. The defenders and civilians unable to evacuate before the assault were forced to stay underground, risking their lives by venturing outside. The enemy's fire was remarkably precise, and one advisor noted that the chances of surviving just 5 minutes out in the open were only 50-50. Most buildings in the city lay in ruins due to the relentless ground assaults, shelling, and airstrikes. The landscape was littered with rubble, shattered trees, trash, and the carcasses of domestic animals. One advisor remarked that it resembled Berlin at the end of World War II. The human cost within the city was horrifying. The streets and ruins were filled with the lifeless bodies of both soldiers and civilians. One advisor noted that the bodies of men, women, and children are everywhere. The air was thick with the stench of death. Amid these circumstances, a multitude of diseases, including cholera, quickly spread through both the civilian population and military ranks. To prevent a widespread epidemic, bodies were interred in mass graves, some containing as many as 300 to 500 corpses, by soldiers using bulldozers during rare moments of quiet between the shelling. Many of these bodies had to be relocated after artillery shells disturbed the original graves. Anti-aircraft fire had increased to the point where resupplying the defenders by air became nearly impossible. Medical supplies were completely depleted, and little could be done for the growing number of wounded. The situation for food and ammunition was hardly any better. Virtually nothing could enter the city. Thus, the wounded had no means of escape. This dire state, combined with ongoing artillery bombardments, severely undermined the morale of the ARVN troops. Advisors feared that the South Vietnamese forces would collapse if the NVA launched another major assault, prompting them to work harder to boost the confidence of their ARVN allies. In these bleak conditions, the defenders, now about 4,000 strong with the arrival of 2 airborne battalions, readied themselves for another North Vietnamese attack. The NVA altered their strategy once more. Captured documents showed that the commander of the 9th VC Division had been reprimanded for failing to achieve his objectives after 2 attempts. The new plan involved the 5th VC Division leading the main assault, supported by units from the 7th NVA and 9th VC Divisions. The attack commenced at 0500 hours on May 11th, with the typical intense opening artillery barrage from the NVA. In the next 12 hours, the city faced 10,000 rounds of enemy artillery fire. With this barrage as cover, the NVA launched assaults from the north and northwest using tanks and infantry. They successfully created 2 breaches in the ARVN defenses, nearly splitting their perimeter in 2. The clashes were fierce, pushing the ARVN defenders to the brink on several occasions. Yet, continuous tactical air support kept the South Vietnamese from being overwhelmed. The skies above the city were crowded with Air Force, Navy, and Marine aircraft, providing close air support. AC-130 gunships, Cobra attack helicopters, and B-52 bombers, all competing to engage the enemy. Thanks to the skillful coordination of the advisors with the Air Force forward air controllers, every available air asset was utilized effectively. This made a crucial difference, once again rescuing the ARVN defenders. On May 11th alone, 297 sorties of tactical air support were executed, with around 260 sorties each day for the next 4 days. Moreover, on May 11th, 30 B-52 strikes targeted enemy positions around An Loc. This air support, provided despite facing some of the fiercest anti-aircraft fire ever seen in South Vietnam, halted the NVA offensive, allowing the ARVN to stabilize their positions and eventually contain the breaches. Unfortunately for those defending An Loc, the situation along Route 13 with the 21st ARVN Division was grim. The division fought up the highway almost inch by inch, suffering heavy losses, including wounded and killed U.S. advisors. Their offensives lacked coordination, and they struggled against the fortified North Vietnamese forces on the road. While the 21st Division couldn't open the road or connect with the defenders in An Loc, their efforts weren't in vain. By attempting to break through the NVA positions, they managed to distract most of an NVA division, preventing its involvement in the battle for An Loc. This was a significant factor in the ultimate outcome, as the presence of that additional NVA division in a direct assault on the city would have likely shifted the odds in favor of the attackers. By the end of May, even though combat continued, the momentum had shifted toward the defenders. The relentless airstrikes had a devastating impact on the North Vietnamese army. ARVN intelligence later estimated that the NVA forces attacking An Loc suffered 10,000 casualties during April and May. The North Vietnamese had reached their peak and were never able to launch a large-scale assault on An Loc again in 1972. By early June, Lieutenant General Min managed to send reinforcements into An Loc and withdraw the battered remnants of the 5th ARVN Division. On June 18th, he announced that the siege of An Loc was broken. However, that did not mean peace had finally returned, as the shelling continued, albeit at a much lower intensity. The conflict around the city persisted sporadically until late summer. On July 9th, Brigadier Richard Tallman, along with 3 of his officers and an ARVN interpreter, was killed shortly after arriving at An Loc for an inspection. 2 American officers, including the author, were wounded in the same attack and were evacuated to Saigon by helicopter. By mid-July, the battle for An Loc was nearly concluded. The relentless shelling, which amounted to over 78,000 rounds during April and May, had left the city almost in ruins. The ARVN defenders suffered 5,400 casualties, with 2,300 either dead or missing. One advisor later remarked that the graves, burned-out vehicles, and rubble stood as silent witnesses to the ferocity of the battle that had unfolded there. Nonetheless, An Loc remained under ARVN control. Despite the heavy toll, the defenders and their advisors, bolstered by American tactical air support, successfully repelled 3 elite divisions of the North Vietnamese Army, holding the city against overwhelming odds, which safeguarded Saigon and decimated a significant portion of 3 enemy divisions. It's estimated that the North Vietnamese incurred 10,000 soldiers killed and 15,000 wounded during the fierce struggle for the city. As previously noted, the intense fighting at An Loc presented a distinctive opportunity to evaluate ARVN combat effectiveness under some of the most challenging conditions of the entire war. Despite the North Vietnamese defeat, the performance of the South Vietnamese troops during the grueling battle for An Loc was, at best, inconsistent. In the South Vietnamese army, like in any military, the effectiveness of the soldiers typically reflects the strength of their leaders. This was especially true during the intense struggle for An Loc. Some units demonstrated near superhuman courage and skill. Lieutenant Colonel Laddie Logan, a U.S. advisor in An Loc, noted after the battle that the 81st never gave up an inch of ground, and they made sure every one of their fallen was buried, even under the worst artillery fire. The Airborne Rangers were among the finest troops in the South Vietnamese forces and held their own during the fierce combat in An Loc. The commander of this unit, known as Tiger 36, called in airstrikes and personally led several counterattacks against the North Vietnamese across the narrow no-man's land dividing the city. He was an inspiring leader who led from the front, and his troops rose to the occasion. Many ARVN soldiers absorbed everything the NVA threw at them and held their ground, despite facing unimaginable hardships and heavy losses. The 3rd Ranger Group, led by Colonel Gwyn Van Beet, started with over 1,000 soldiers when the NVA launched their first assault. After 3 months of fighting, only 346 remained uninjured. Medical support was scarce, but the soldiers continued to fight as best they could under dire conditions. The territorial forces under Colonel Tran van Noot displayed remarkable performance throughout the siege of Anlak. Noot was a charismatic leader, visibly present to his troops during the conflict. Before the battle, he ensured his RFPF soldiers were well prepared and trained. Once the fighting began, they responded to his guidance and example. Many had lost family members and seen their homes destroyed, but they fought passionately for their cause, standing strong against the North Vietnamese regulars. Their morale stayed high throughout the conflict, despite suffering severe casualties. Noot's leadership had a noticeable impact early in the battle. When the tanks attacked on the morning of April 13th, the ARVN soldiers and their advisors fell back in the face of the armored onslaught. The soldiers were filled with panic, and it seemed like their defense was on the verge of collapse, when one of Noot's PF soldiers boldly stepped out into the open, grabbed several M72 Laws, and halted the leading tank in its tracks. This brave act energized the defenders, making them realize that they could indeed stop the North Vietnamese tanks. This newfound understanding calmed everyone down and helped stabilize the situation. Throughout the siege, the performance of the Bin Long sector troops remained commendable. In April and May, as the NVA tightened its grip around An Lac, reconnaissance operations by the 5th ARVN Division nearly came to a standstill. Yet, the Bin Long Reconnaissance and Intelligence Platoon, often dressed as civilians, managed to infiltrate enemy lines repeatedly to gather valuable intelligence that proved essential for targeting by the ever-present close air support. The Airborne Brigade and Ranger battalions also performed exceptionally well. When the Airborne were deployed to the high ground east of the city at the start of the battle, they quickly found themselves in fierce combat. The 6th Battalion fought valiantly but suffered so many casualties that it became combat ineffective. Meanwhile, the other 2 airborne battalions fought their way onto the eastern side of the city and played a crucial role in countering NVA assaults from that direction. The townspeople were full of praise for the regional and popular forces, the Airborne Brigade, and the Ranger battalions. The Rangers, in particular, had a strong bond with the locals. They shared their food, and in return, the civilians cooked for them and did their laundry. When one of the civilians was injured, the Ranger medics were there to help. However, not all South Vietnamese soldiers earned respect. Many townspeople in An Lac held nothing but disdain for some members of the 5th ARVN Division, who engaged in significant looting and even fired into houses to force residents out so they could loot the empty buildings. Some soldiers from the 5th ARVN were seen selling food and medical supplies that had been airdropped. On several occasions, they even fired at airborne and ranger troops who were trying to recover those supplies for their own units. The most discouraging example of poor discipline became evident in various incidents described by one advisor as the Olympic wounded. On at least 2 occasions, American evacuation helicopters faced intense ground fire to land in or near the city to retrieve casualties, only for some wounded ARVN soldiers to abandon their more seriously injured comrades in a rush to board the helicopters. These events highlighted a significant lack of leadership within the units from which these troops came. As noted earlier, effective leadership was crucial in shaping soldiers' performance. When leaders were proactive and endured the same hardships as their men, the soldiers excelled. Colonel Walter F. Ulmer, a senior advisor to the 5th ARVN Division, recounted one such event. During the last major assault on An Lac, the NVA encircled part of an ARVN battalion stationed at the city jail on the night of May 10 to 11. The South Vietnamese forces were running low on ammunition and were nearly defenseless. The NVA communicated with the ARVN commander, acknowledging his fight and offering him the chance to surrender honorably with the promise of protection, but threatening death if he refused. He firmly rejected such terms. Within hours, the NVA overtook their position, and the battalion commander, along with his soldiers, fought bravely to the very last man. Their remains were discovered on June 12th, when the 7th ARVN Regiment conducted a house-to-house clearing operation. This commander and his troops had willingly given their all. Such bravery is rare in any army. Additionally, the regimental commander of the 7th Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Kwan, promoted to colonel on the spot by President Thieu during his visit, was wounded 3 times in the battle's early days and commanded while propped up in his cot through the critical mid-May period. In another remarkable case, a small ranger base at Tonglachan, located just outside the city, was besieged by overwhelming enemy numbers. The Rangers remained relentless, repelling repeated assaults from the North Vietnamese. The firebase withstood the siege even after fighting resumed post-ceasefire in January 1973. It only fell to the North Vietnamese in late 1974. The fierce clashes at An Loc revealed both the noblest and basest elements of human nature. Many ARVN soldiers fought bravely against significant challenges, persistently pushing back multiple waves of tank and infantry assaults while enduring what felt like endless indirect fire. Yet, alongside these heroic efforts, some showed a lack of discipline and even cowardice in the face of danger. Despite this mixed performance, the ARVN managed to withstand the relentless NVA attacks, and when the battle concluded, the city was still under South Vietnamese control. President Nixon celebrated this outcome as proof of his Vietnamization program, asserting that the South Vietnamese had clearly shown their readiness to fight their war without American assistance. While this was politically advantageous for a president seeking to pull away from Vietnam, the reality was that the battle for An Loc had come extremely close to a different outcome. Yes, the ARVN had held An Loc, but 2 crucial factors also played a significant role in their victory: U.S. air power and the presence of advisors on the ground with ARVN units. The tactical air support was so vital that it is likely the city would have fallen without it. A total of 247 B-52 missions and 9,203 tactical airstrikes targeted the North Vietnamese in Loc Ninh, An Loc, and along Route 13. Additionally, Air Force C-130 Spectre gunships and Army Cobra attack helicopters were instrumental in defending the city. By most accounts, this air support was key to the victory. In late 1972, members of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations visited Saigon to assess how the South Vietnamese defended against the North Vietnamese invasion. During one briefing at MAS-CV headquarters, a member asked what would have happened without U.S. air support, to which the briefer responded, "We would be meeting some other place today." General Creighton Abrams, the former MAF-V commander, later remarked that, in his view, American air power, and not South Vietnamese arms, had caused North Vietnamese losses. This assessment was echoed by participants at all levels. Brigadier General John R. McGiffert, the deputy of Major General Hollingsworth in MR3, when asked about the ARVN's ability to hold An Loc without American tactical air support after the battle, simply replied, "No contest, never would have hacked it." This might seem like a stern evaluation, but even South Vietnamese generals acknowledged that the city would have fallen without the swift action of both Army attack helicopters and U.S. Air Force support. General Cao Van Vien, part of the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff, remarked after the war, "Without this tactical air support, the RVNF's success in halting the enemy invasion would have been impossible." There's no doubt that U.S. air support kept the defenders from being overwhelmed. Had that occurred, 3 NVA divisions would have faced little resistance in launching a direct attack on Saigon. Tactical air power played a crucial role in saving An Loc and possibly Saigon as well. U.S. air support also included aerial resupply, vital for the ARVN defenders who managed to hold out for nearly 3 months. As the North Vietnamese tightened their grip around An Loc and increased their anti-aircraft defenses, the skies over An Loc quickly became dangerous. Initially, the C-130s from the 7th U.S. Air Force struggled to deliver supplies to the defenders, with most parachute drops landing in enemy hands during April. After extensive testing to find the best methods, the U.S. Air Force successfully completed 238 airdrops, delivering 3,100 tons of food, medical supplies, and ammunition in May and June. Without this resupply, the defenders wouldn't have been able to hold their ground. One post-war report noted, Along with the defenders' resilience and the swift response of the airstrike forces, the effective air resupply of Anlok proved to be a decisive factor in the Allied victory. While air support was crucial to the success at Anlok, American advisors on the ground played an essential role too. They served in several important capacities, staying with their counterparts throughout the battle and sharing in the daily struggles. Some advisors in MRN were pulled out during the NVA attack, which severely impacted the ARVN units and their capacity to resist the North Vietnamese forces. Representing U.S. commitment to South Vietnam, the presence of the advisors in An Loc strengthened the resolve of ARVN commanders during this critical time. The support and encouragement they offered to their counterparts should not be overlooked. This support proved crucial during the darkest days of the fierce North Vietnamese assaults in April and early May. Importantly, the advisors served as the vital connection between the ground troops and the key American tactical aircraft and helicopters that were essential to the fight. Without these advisors and their radios, the ARVN defenders would have struggled to communicate with the aircraft. The advisors worked tirelessly to coordinate around-the-clock airstrikes that kept the North Vietnamese forces from overwhelming the city. Brigadier General McGiffert noted that the ARVN defenders wouldn't have held out without the advisors managing the air support. He emphasized that the advisors' main role was to coordinate U.S. tactical air support, stating that without them, defending An Loc would have been nearly impossible. Another vital contribution from the American advisors in An Loc was leading by example. When leadership was strong, many of the ARVN soldiers fought bravely and maintained their resolve under challenging conditions. However, when leadership faltered, the troops often panicked and their performance suffered. Some ARVN commanders, especially those in Ranger and airborne units, demonstrated exceptional combat leadership under tremendous pressure, but there were also times when officer leadership fell short. On several occasions, the situation came dangerously close to collapse, yet many reports affirm that the advisors were the glue holding the ARVN forces together. Compounding the leadership issue was the tactical competence of numerous ARVN commanders. The circumstances in An Loc were vastly different from past counterinsurgency operations, as facing tanks and heavy enemy artillery was nothing like pursuing insurgents in the jungle. One advisor later reflected that the regimental and higher-level leaders were neither tactically nor psychologically equipped for a battle as prolonged and intense as the Bin Long campaign, while battalion leaders were unprepared for the close coordination required between fire and maneuver elements. The Americans brought their expertise in high-intensity conventional warfare, which defined the fighting for An Loc. While it's clear that U.S. air power and American advisors were crucial in defending An Loc, it's vital to recognize that their efforts wouldn't have mattered without the South Vietnamese soldiers standing firm. General Creighton Abrams, the Massey V commander, expressed it well when he said, "I doubt the ARVN defense would have held without U.S. air. But first, it required that a number of Vietnamese decided to stand and fight. If they hadn't, no amount of air support would have made a difference. We wouldn't be where we are today if those Vietnamese hadn't chosen to stand and fight." In the end, the ARVN and their American allies combined their efforts, bolstered by a significant amount of U.S. air power, to achieve a remarkable victory at An Loc. A Time magazine correspondent, Rudolf Roch, relayed the words of one of the American advisors in An Loc in early June. "To grasp the Battle of An Loc, remember that the ARVN are there and the North Vietnamese are not. Any other perspective does an injustice to the Vietnamese people." Despite facing numerous challenges, the South Vietnamese soldiers showed incredible resilience and ultimately emerged victorious. While there were notable flaws, they mounted a stubborn, even heroic, defense. This showcased that, with consistent support from the United States, they had a fighting chance to survive, even after American combat troops departed. A touching honor for these resilient soldiers came in the form of a monument from the grateful community of An Loc, dedicated to the 81st Rangers. This monument was placed in a cemetery specifically created for the fallen members of that unit during the city's defense. It read, "An Loc sa vang dan chien dia biet cash duvi quoc vong tan," which translates to, "Here, On the renowned battlefield of An Loc Town, the airborne rangers have sacrificed their lives for the nation. Such sacrifice extended beyond the airborne rangers, as An Loc remained free thanks to the South Vietnamese soldiers. They, with the support of American air power and their advisors, fought valiantly against formidable odds. The true tragedy for the Republic of Vietnam is that the efforts of its soldiers in An Loc, Quang Tri, and Con Tum ultimately went unrecognized. With the backing of the United States, the South Vietnamese not only survived the intense North Vietnamese attack that began on Good Friday in 1972, but they also scored a significant victory. Following that triumph, Saigon agreed to the Paris Peace Accords, largely influenced by Richard Nixon's repeated assurances of continued American support for the South Vietnamese cause. However, once U.S. troops withdrew, the South Vietnamese managed to hold their ground during the fighting that continued into 1974. But when the North Vietnamese escalated their efforts in December of that year, the promised support was absent, leading to the rapid collapse of the South Vietnamese in under 55 days. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973, by the United States, the Republic of Vietnam, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam. This agreement initiated a ceasefire, and the United States committed to fully withdrawing all troops, military advisors, and personnel from South Vietnam within 60 days. Unfortunately, the accords did not account for the estimated 150,000 North Vietnamese troops remaining in South Vietnam. For the United States, the war had come to an end. For the South Vietnamese, the ceasefire was merely a temporary pause before entering the next phase of the conflict against the Communists, one where they would stand alone without American support. At the time the ceasefire took effect, the South Vietnamese controlled most of the populated areas of the country, while PVN forces occupied the northernmost regions of Military Region 1 south of the DMZ, parts of northwestern Con Tum province in the Central Highlands, and areas of Phuoc Long and northern Bin Long provinces in Military Region 3 along the Cambodian border. After a brief lull following the ceasefire, fierce fighting erupted throughout South Vietnam as both sides fought for control over disputed territory. U.S. Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker recalled a U.S. pacification official in Lam Dong province, saying that the ceasefire seemed to spark a new, even more intense and brutal war. In just the first 3 weeks after hostilities officially ended, there were more than 3,000 ceasefire violations. The North Vietnamese sought to secure positions that could serve as entry points for war supplies and facilitate infiltration along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. From late January to July, key battles took place in Quang Ngai,Ien Phuong, Con Tum, and Pleiku provinces, resulting in heavy losses for both sides. Concerned by these clashes and intelligence about the North Vietnamese buildup, South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu traveled to the U.S. to meet with President Nixon in early April 1973. He voiced his concerns about PAN ceasefire breaches and shared that there were credible reports indicating the Communists were gearing up for a general offensive. Thieu noted that Nixon seemed distracted during their conversation, but Nixon reiterated his commitment to support Saigon, mentioning renewed military aid at the $1 billion level. However, Nixon was preoccupied with the escalating Watergate scandal and wanted to avoid adding more turmoil surrounding Indochina to his growing domestic issues. Still anxious about Nixon's promises and eager to gain territorial advantages over the PAN, Thieu returned to Saigon and ordered his forces to go on the offensive. Consequently, the ARVN launched attacks in the coastal lowlands, the Mekong Delta, the western mountainous areas near Cambodia and Laos, and several provinces around Saigon. In October, the North Vietnamese launched their own offensive to secure more territory and maintain their supply lines. While the South Vietnamese managed to hold their ground against the PAVN, this ceasefire war resulted in 26,500 ARVN deaths in 1973, with nearly 30,000 expected the following year. As fighting stretched into 1974, South Vietnam faced severe shortages of ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and other vital materials for war. With dwindling supplies and no replacements in sight, Thieu found himself waging a poor man's war. On August 9, 1974, while contending with the largest communist offensive since the ceasefire, South Vietnam suffered a shattering blow with President Nixon's resignation. His successor, Gerald Ford, reassured the nation that Nixon's commitment to support would continue, but Ford couldn't deliver on those promises. This became clear in October when Congress allocated just $700 million in military and economic aid for the year ending June 30, 1975, significantly less than the $1 billion originally sought. The double blow of Nixon's departure and the cut in military aid severely damaged South Vietnamese morale. The Politburo in Hanoi, emboldened by the turn of events, decided to launch an attack to gauge how the United States would respond if South Vietnamese forces found themselves in dire straits. They chose Phuoc Long Province, a relatively remote area defended by only 4 regional force battalions and some popular force platoons. On December 13, 1974, the PIAV N 301st Corps, which included the newly formed 3rd Division and the experienced 7th Division, along with tanks and artillery, initiated their assault. They quickly overran South Vietnamese outposts, focusing their main attack on the Song Bi airfield. Saigon hurried reinforcements to the region, but North Vietnamese forces overwhelmed the ARVN, concluding the battle in the first week of January. North Vietnam swiftly captured the entire province in just days. The South Vietnamese losses were devastating. Of the 5,400 ARVN and regional defense forces that fought, only 850 managed to survive. The fall of Phuoc Long Province weighed heavily on both the South Vietnamese people and their military. Further complicating the situation in Saigon was the absence of any significant response from the United States. In his first State of the Union address on January 15, 1975, President Ford didn't even mention South Vietnam. A few days later, during a press conference, Ford stated that he envisioned no scenario in which the United States would re-enter the Vietnam War. The South Vietnamese were taken aback. Not only had they been cut off from support, but now the U.S. had publicly distanced itself from them. General Cao Van Vien, former chairman of the Joint General Staff, reflected after the war that Ford's statement affected the South as profoundly as the Tet Offensive in 1968. The apparent apathy from the United States and other non-communist nations regarding this tragic loss deepened the doubts among the Vietnamese about the Paris Agreement's effectiveness. Almost extinguished was the hope that the United States would take decisive action against the North Vietnamese for their blatant breaches of the ceasefire. The public's faith in the military and the government was profoundly shaken. The fall of Phuoc Long Province marked a significant turning point in the Vietnam War. It highlighted the vulnerability of both South Vietnam and the United States and foreshadowed a series of events that would lead to South Vietnam's downfall. News of the ARVN defeat at Phuoc Long reached the members of the 23rd Plenum of the Lao Dong Party while they were still convened in Hanoi. The North Vietnamese leadership was ecstatic. For the first time since 1972, the PAVN had liberated an entire province, further undermining the South Vietnamese's already fragile confidence. The ARVN's failure to defend against the PVN offensive, coupled with Ford's inaction and public announcement, convinced the North Vietnamese leaders that the moment had arrived to initiate their final offensive. Never have we had military and political conditions so perfect or a strategic advantage so significant as we have now, stated First Secretary Le Duan, prompting the military leadership to craft plans to exploit this opportunity. The outcome was an ambitious 2-year strategy calling for extensive major offensives in the South in 1975 to set the stage for a broader uprising in 1976. On January 9th, the day after the 23rd Plenum concluded, the Central Military Committee and General Staff convened to devise detailed plans for the initial phase of the new offensive. The focus shifted to Ban Mae Thuot in the Central Highlands, where a successful strike would secure another province for the North Vietnamese and create launching points for a future push to capture Pleiku, the key city in the area. The Politburo green-lighted the plan and tasked General Van Tien Dung with leading what was dubbed Campaign 275. Meanwhile, South Vietnamese military leaders in Saigon though unaware of the North's intentions in the highlands, anticipated that the Pa Ven would seize the opportunity following their win in Phuoc Long. They turned to President Thieu for direction, but he offered none, seemingly still reeling from the loss of an entire province. His indecision during the Phuoc Long battle had led to significant losses of soldiers and equipment, which were hard to replenish. Thieu's failure to address the escalating crisis would have dire consequences as the North Vietnamese continued their assault. The Joint General Staff urged him to explore a new defensive strategy that reflected the changing battlefield dynamics. They suggested truncation or pulling back to more defensible positions. Yet, Thieu dismissed their suggestions outright, insisting that no territory be surrendered to the North without a fight. Former Ambassador Bui Diem argues that Thieu clung to the belief that the Americans would never stand by while communists overtook South Vietnam, despite the recent loss of Phuoc Long. This belief would prove misguided. President Ford understood that neither Congress nor the American public would support a renewed direct involvement in South Vietnam. However, he aimed to secure additional military funding for Saigon to uphold the promises made to Thieu. Yet, Ford's administration faced criticism over rising unemployment, a growing national debt, and the ongoing energy crisis following the 1973 Arab oil embargo, leaving him obstructed at every turn by a skeptical Congress in his efforts to assist the South Vietnamese. His administration worked diligently to push for a supplemental military aid request, arguing to Congress that cutting aid would seriously weaken South Vietnamese forces during a critical time as communist forces were becoming more powerful and aggressive. They insisted it was crucial to demonstrate to the world that the U.S. stands firmly by its commitments and continues to be a reliable ally. However, despite these efforts, the new aid request faced strong resistance in Congress. 82 bipartisan members of Congress for Peace Through Law addressed a letter to the president, expressing that they found no humanitarian or national interest to warrant aid to Southeast Asia. In February 1975, in a bid to gain support for his military aid proposal, Ford dispatched a bipartisan congressional delegation to South Vietnam to evaluate the military, political, and economic landscape. He believed that this visit could persuade the members that South Vietnam would collapse without further U.S. support. Upon arriving in Saigon on February 26th, they met with Ambassador Graham Martin and his team. According to CIA analyst Frank Snepp, the delegation quickly adopted an adversarial stance, growing suspicious of Martin, hostile toward his staff, and determined to rely as little as possible on the embassy for guidance. During a whirlwind of meetings, discussions, and field visits, delegation members swiftly formed a negative impression of Thieu, his administration, and the entire situation in South Vietnam. In their meeting with President Thieu, he confronted them, referencing the assurances of 5 U.S. presidents and posing the question, is the commitment made by the U.S. to be of any value? Can the U.S. be trusted? The delegation robustly challenged Thieu with their concerns to the extent that Ambassador Martin later had to apologize for their rude and contemptuous demeanor. Unfortunately, the trip that President Ford had hoped would sway the lawmakers to approve further aid for Saigon had the opposite result. After returning to Washington, Representative Paul McCloskey, a Republican from California, released a report predicting that the North Vietnamese would take control of the South within 3 years, regardless of any U.S. military support. Shortly after the congressional delegation got back, both the Democratic caucus in the House and Senate voted against providing any more aid to South Vietnam and Cambodia. During their time in Saigon, the representatives received the latest DAO intelligence report, which indicated that the North Vietnamese were poised for a significant offensive. This report revealed that the North Vietnamese had increased their strategic reserve from 2 divisions to 7, making over 70,000 additional soldiers available to reinforce the already present 200,000 combat troops and 100,000 support personnel in the South. It also highlighted that these forces could be positioned in the Central Highlands in under 15 days. Anticipating a major offensive in the northern part of South Vietnam, the report warned that the campaign is expected to assume countrywide proportions, and several indicators suggest the introduction of strategic reserve divisions from NVN. The DAO intelligence estimate turned out to be quite accurate. While budget discussions continued in the U.S., the North Vietnamese were gearing up for Campaign 275. In late January, they began deploying more troops into Darlac province. 5 main infantry divisions, along with 15 regiments of tanks, artillery, anti-aircraft units, and engineers, totaling around 75,000 to 80,000 North Vietnamese troops, were moving toward Ban Ma Thuot. When the battle commenced, the ARVN defenders would consist of a regiment from the 23rd ARVN Division, a ranger group, and various regional force units. General Dung's strategy was fairly straightforward, utilizing a tactic he initially employed against the French in 1952, known as the Blossoming Lotus. This operation aimed to launch the attack from the center of enemy positions while avoiding outer strong points, gradually spreading outwards, like a flower bud slowly opening its petals. He planned to kick off the assault by striking in other areas of the Central Highlands to draw the South Vietnamese focus away from his primary attack. His aim was to cut off all access routes from the highland provinces to the lowlands, preventing ARVN reinforcements from reaching Ban Ma Thuot. Once this was accomplished, the main strike would target the city itself. Even though ARVN intelligence rightly anticipated that the PAN were gearing up to capture Ban Ma Thuot, Le Gen Pham Van Phu, the commander of 6th Corps, disagreed. He believed the enemy's movements towards Ban Ma Thuot were a secondary concern, with their main focus likely on Pleiku or Kontum. This belief was bolstered by Dung's diversionary strikes from the 968th Pavan Division on various outposts and firebases north and west of Kontum and Pleiku. Misled by these initial assaults, Phu kept the 23rd ARVN Division stationed at Pleiku. Even after confirming that the 320th Division was advancing towards Ban Ma Thuot, he only dispatched one regiment, the 53rd from his 23rd ARVN Division, to bolster the city's defense. On March 4th, PAVN forces cut Route 19 in 2 locations between Quy Nhon and Pleiku. The following day, more North Vietnamese troops blocked Route 21 at 3 points between Ban Ma Thuot and the coast. 3 days later, the 9th Regiment of the 320th Division severed Route 14 north of Buon Blech, effectively isolating Ban Ma Thuot. By midday on March 9th, it was clear to Lieutenant General Phu that the PAVN were zeroing in on Ban Ma Thuot. He quickly dispatched the 21st Ranger Group to Buon Ho, 20 miles north of the city, and called the Joint General Staff for reinforcements, only to find none were available. The battle for Ban Ma Thuot commenced at 2 a.m. on March 10th, as the North Vietnamese launched a coordinated 2-pronged attack using 3 divisions, tanks, and infantry. The initial strike was led by the 320th Division, a unit Dung had commanded earlier, which advanced from the north to capture an ammunition depot and a small airstrip for light aircraft. By mid-afternoon, they succeeded in seizing both the depot and the airstrip. Meanwhile, the second wave of the 320th assault targeted Phuong Duc Airfield, east of the city, where the 53rd ARVN Regiment put up a fierce resistance, momentarily halting the PAN advance. As the 320th launched its assault in the north, the F-10 Division and parts of the 316th Division pressed forward from the south. Their target was the sector headquarters, and what quickly turned into a fierce battle saw ARVN defenders holding their ground, dealing substantial blows to the PN forces. Yet, the situation shifted dramatically when the ARVN, showcasing their long-standing challenge in coordinating fire support, mistakenly hit their own sector command post with an artillery round meant for the PAVN tanks. This misfire disrupted communications and resulted in the deaths and injuries of crucial personnel. At that moment, the ARVN defense crumbled, overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemy troops. By nightfall, the North Vietnamese had seized much of the city's center, while the South Vietnamese managed to hold on to isolated positions at the airfield and along the eastern, western, and southern perimeters. The battle raged on into the night, with PAVN forces using flamethrowers to flush out the ARVN defenders. The following day, March 11th, the Communist forces escalated their onslaught. By noon, They had captured the command post of the 23rd ARVN Division and most of the remaining South Vietnamese strongholds, taking numerous senior officers prisoner, including the province chief and the deputy commander of the 23rd Division. As the conflict erupted in Ban Mae Thuot, President Thieu faced a significant decision, one that would ultimately lead to his nation's downfall. Reeling from the devastating loss at Phuoc Long and with Darlac province under severe attack, Thieu realized he had to take drastic action before everything slipped away. The RVNF were stretched too thin, overextended in their commitments. Previously, Thieu had insisted on holding all territory at all costs. However, the loss of Phuoc Long in January and the imminent fall of Ban Mae Thuot made it clear that this approach was no longer workable. On March 11, 1975, as PN forces moved to overrun the 23rd Division command post in Ban Mae Thuot, Thieu met with General Vien and Lecher-Gen Dang Van Quang over breakfast. Thieu said, "Given our current strength and capabilities, we certainly cannot hold and defend all the territory we desire." He concluded that RVNF forces should concentrate on safeguarding only the most essential populated areas. While examining a small map, he pinpointed what he considered the most crucial locations. He declared that MRs 3 and 4 were critical and must be defended at all costs. Any territory lost in these areas needed to be retaken. This region, home to most of South Vietnam's population and resources, was to be regarded as the untouchable heartland, the irreducible national stronghold. In contrast, he seemed less confident about MRs 1 and 2. There had been nearly constant fighting in MR since the ceasefire, and the PAN was particularly strong there. Still, Hue and Da Nang remained significant. Thus, in MR1, the approach would be to hold what you can. In the Central Highlands, Ban Mae Thuot was vital due to its economic and demographic value, and major coastal cities also needed to be defended. To achieve his objectives, he marked a series of phase lines on the map to outline how RVNF would retreat if they found themselves unable to withstand the PAN assault. If the South Vietnamese forces were capable, they would maintain their positions up to Hue or Da Nang. If not, they were to withdraw to the south, first to Quang Ngai, then Quy Nhon, and ultimately to a final defensive line just north of Tuy Hoa. This new strategy, later referred to as light at the top, heavy on the bottom, highlighted Thu's plan to trade space for time. He was essentially truncating South Vietnam, as his generals had previously advised. General Vien later noted that he publicly supported the president's new strategy during the meeting, but harbored serious concerns because he felt it was too late for any effective redeployment of such scale. From a purely military perspective, Thieu's decision wasn't a poor one. 7 of the ARVN's 13 divisions were stationed in MRs and 2, defending merely 1/5 of the population. It made logical sense to shorten the lines and reposition these forces to bolster defenses in MRs 3 and 4, where over 12 million people lived. However, executing a withdrawal under fire is one of the most challenging military tactics. If it isn't conducted in an orderly and controlled manner, it can quickly lead to disaster. Thieu's strategy might have succeeded if it had been put into action earlier. However, his choice to execute a large withdrawal while facing intense enemy pressure was poorly conceived and even worse in execution. This led to the disintegration of the South Vietnamese armed forces and had dire consequences for the Republic of Vietnam overall. By the evening of March 11th, the North Vietnamese had taken control of most of Darlac province. Still, some remnants of 2 ARVN battalions were engaged in battle within Ban Mae Thuot, and the South Vietnamese retained control of Phuoc An airfield, located about 30 kilometers east of the city. The ARVN attempted a counteroffensive with the 21st Ranger Group, which reached the outskirts of Ban Mae Thuot, but faltered when Brig Gen Le Van Tuong, commander of the 23rd ARVN Division, ordered the Rangers to secure a landing zone outside the town to safeguard the evacuation of his wife and children by helicopter. Losing momentum, the Rangers tried to continue their assault, but encountered fierce resistance from Pa Ven reinforcements who arrived while they were assisting Tuong's family evacuation. A crucial chance to relieve Ban Mae Thuot slipped away. President Thieu instructed Lieutenant General Phu to launch another counterattack. Phu then ordered the 44th and 45th Regiments of the 23rd Division to be airlifted to Phuoc An from Pleiku. This mission was fated to fail from the outset due to significant helicopter support issues. Over 3 days, the operational CH-47 helicopters available for the movement to Phuoc dropped from 12 to just 1 because of maintenance troubles and a shortage of spare parts. Consequently, by March 14th, only the 45th Regiment and 1 battalion from the 44th had made it to Phuoc. When the counteroffensive began on March 15th, it barely advanced since they were seriously outgunned by the Pavan fortified along the route. Due to poor planning and ongoing issues with helicopter support, the ARVN initiated the counterattack without artillery or tank backup. The situation deteriorated further because of poor leadership that stretched all the way to the top. On March 16th, Brigadier General Tuong, who had previously aborted the effective Ranger assault and now led the counterattack, again showed he was unfit for command. He suffered a minor facial injury and opted for evacuation by helicopter to a hospital in Nha Trang instead of continuing the mission. Unsurprisingly, the attack, plagued by poor leadership and mass desertion, faltered. By the following day, it had turned into a retreat, with the attackers merging into streams of refugees heading east. The remaining ARVN positions in Ban Ma Thuot were overtaken, and the South Vietnamese defenders were either killed or captured. On March 18th, the Pavan overran the airfield at Phuoc, eliminating the last location from which the ARVN could mount a counterattack. Darlak province had completely fallen to the communist forces. The loss of Ban Ma Thuot was just the beginning of greater calamity. The swift disintegration of the South Vietnamese forces left Dung and his generals in shock. North Vietnamese Maj Gen Tran Con Man later remarked that the South Vietnamese were caught off guard in the attack on Ban Ma Thuot, just as they surprised the North Vietnamese by becoming disorganized so rapidly. This was unexpected. They anticipated that after the Ban Ma Thuot attack, the South Vietnamese would rally and fight back, expecting a fierce and prolonged battle around the area. Equally astonishing was the U.S. inaction in supporting the struggling RVNF. Dung quickly regained his composure and recognized the significant opportunity before him. With the collapse of the ARVN in Darlak province, there were no organized South Vietnamese forces remaining between the Payan and the South China Sea. Dung was on the verge of splitting South Vietnam in half, isolating RVNAF units in Con Tum, Pleiku, Binh Dinh, and further north in Mr Wan. Seizing the moment, Dung informed Hanoi of his intention to redirect his forces northward to take Pleiku and Con Tum. While Dung readied his next move, Thieu and his generals were grappling with how to respond. They convened on March 14th at Cam Ranh, where Thieu asked Lieutenant General Phu if he could retake Ban Ma Thuot. Phu begged for reinforcements, only to be told there were none available. Thieu laid out his new strategy and ordered Phu to redeploy 2 Corps Nat forces in a way that would allow them to retake Ban Ma Thuot at all costs. Phu was taken aback and initially thought the president was joking. To mount a counterattack on Ban Ma Thuot, he faced the necessity of withdrawing his remaining forces from Con Tum and Pleiku, essentially leaving these critical cities to the North Vietnamese. After overcoming his initial shock at the orders he received, Phu held a brief conference with his staff and then commanded the pullback from Con Tum and Pleiku toward the coast via Route 7, a rarely utilized logging route stretching 200 kilometers southeast from Pleiku to Toi Hoa. This withdrawal was set to start 2 days later. Over the course of 4 days, a convoy of 250 vehicles would depart from Pleiku, traveling down Route 7 to Toi Hoa. The first column, led by the 20th Combat Engineer Group, would focus on repairing bridges and improving the road along the way, while the Ranger units would trail behind in the final column. As the lead elements readied for departure, the South Vietnamese Air Force would prioritize evacuating aircraft, personnel, and their families. Lieutenant General Phu and his staff were among the first to leave, while Caller Le Coq Lee, Phu's chief of staff, remained with the convoy. The actual command of the convoy went to the newly promoted Brigadier General Pham Duy Tat, head of the 2 Corps Rangers. As Tat busied himself organizing his 6 Ranger groups, the planning for the withdrawal fell to lie. Officials in the Ford administration, already anxious about losing Ban Ma Thuot, were caught off guard by the swift withdrawal from Pleiku. Their worries intensified when Thomas Polgar, of the Central Intelligence Agency alerted Washington that the game was over. Even with such grim predictions, the administration tried to maintain an optimistic outlook. General William C. Westmoreland, the Army Chief of Staff, described the redeployment as prudent action. However, this perspective shifted quickly as the evacuation began to unravel, causing growing concern in both the White House and the Pentagon. Meanwhile, the situation in Secor began to spiral out of control. What began as a tactical repositioning of forces soon appeared to be a frantic retreat. News of the evacuation leaked too early, prompting some commanders in Khartoum to initiate their own withdrawals without awaiting orders from two corps. As the Pavans started shelling Khartoum, an influx of soldiers and civilians poured down the road to Pleiku. The conditions in Pleiku were no better. Panic erupted when Colonel Lai alerted unit commanders about the need to prepare for a move. While some commanders from the regular forces challenged the evacuation order, the regional and popular forces, sensing they were about to be left behind, began rioting in the streets. As the disorder escalated, the regular forces joined in the panic. Colonel Lai described the scene. The troops and their dependents lost all discipline. There was looting, arson, and assaults. They became chaotic after hearing the order. I can't hold it against them. There was no plan in place to care for their families. Amidst this turmoil, the PAVN began shelling the airfield. The destruction of ammunition and fuel storage by departing ARVN soldiers fueled the belief that Pleiku was on the brink of being surrendered to the North Vietnamese, igniting fear among both soldiers and civilians. When the first convoy left on the night of March 16th, the panic intensified. One reporter later noted that doctors fled their hospitals, police discarded their uniforms, and fires and looting became widespread. Civilians snatched up their few belongings and hurried after the army. A Catholic nun recalled, "Babies and children were loaded into ox carts. Panic reigned. People were desperate to hire vehicles at any cost." The urgency to escape Pleiku surged when rumors spread that Thieu had struck a deal with Hanoi, supposedly promising South Vietnam's neutrality if Thieu forsook the northern provinces. These rumors fueled the civilian panic even further. There is evidence indicating that such rumors were planted by Pavan propaganda and communist agents infiltrating both the military and the South Vietnamese government. Regardless of their source, the rumors severely impacted the military's morale, leading to doubts about the justification for continuing the fight. The retreat from Khartoum and Pleiku, along treacherous secondary roads, would have been challenging even under ideal circumstances. Yet with the North Vietnamese closely pursuing and a throng of terrified civilians mixed with military units, the retreat descended into complete chaos. By March 18, over 200,000 troops and refugees were crammed together along a short stretch of road, marking what would be known as the Convoy of Tears. Chaos erupted. Units lost their organization and control vanished. Troops found their movements blocked by throngs of civilians, many who fled Pleiku carrying only what they could manage on their backs, with barely any food or water available. To make matters worse, they faced harassment from bands of deserters. This chaotic scene made it nearly impossible for the ARVN to set up a coherent defense along the road. As the ARVN began to evacuate Pleiku, General Dung, caught off guard once again, quickly regained his composure. Recognizing an opportunity to obliterate an entire South Vietnamese corps, he dispatched the 320th Division to move from its position along Route 14 to attack the fleeing South Vietnamese from the side. Simultaneously, he ordered the 968th Division to hit the rear of the column, while the B-1 front forces were instructed to block Route 7B ahead of the leading group. This was a classic Viet Cong ambush tactic, but it had never been executed on such a grand scale. As night fell on March 18th, the PAVN opened fire on the packed soldiers and refugees along Route 7. Soon after, the 320th PAVN Division launched an assault near the front of the column at Cheo Rio. At the same time, other PAVN units attacked the back of the main column near Than An at the crossroads of routes 14 and 7. Throughout the night, the PAN bombarded the column, unleashing small arms, machine gun, and anti-tank fire. The impact on such tightly packed soldiers, vehicles, and civilians was catastrophic. One injured soldier evacuated from Cheoreo described the Paven onslaught, stating, "They hit us with everything. People were lying all over the road as we tried to fight our way out. Soldiers died and the people died with them. Some units put up a brave fight against overwhelming odds, but ultimately discipline broke down and the situation quickly worsened." Just like in Ban Mae Thuot, hundreds if not thousands of ARVN soldiers deserted in the face of the enemy, seeking out their families to ensure their safety or just trying to save themselves. General Thin, the former commander of the Corps Artillery, later commended the leaders who attempted to keep their units intact, yet he revealed how everything ultimately unraveled. "We must acknowledge the battalion commanders and lower-ranking officers for marching alongside their troops, but they could no longer command their exhausted and worn-out men. The soldiers shouted insults directed at Tio for this impossible and dreadful retreat. The despair reached such levels that some even turned on their officers. An artillery battalion commander, part of the retreating group, was shot by some rangers who coveted his watch. The sense of hopelessness was so profound that 2 or 3 guerrillas could capture 100 rangers. The families of retreating soldiers faced starvation and illness along the way. It was sheer hell. On March 21st, the Pavan overwhelmed the rear of the main body, swiftly moved down the road, and took Cheoreo, completely cutting off Route 7. In the following week, the PA-VN wreaked havoc throughout the length of the South Vietnamese column. By March 27th, those who survived at the front of the ARVN column joined forces with soldiers from a territorial unit that had been fighting east of Tuy Hoa. But the retreat was an unqualified disaster. Out of the 60,000 troops that initially left Pleiku and Kontum, only around 20,000 reached Tuy Hoa, and most were not combat ready. Merely about 700 of the original 7,000 Rangers managed to escape. General Vian reported that in just 10 days, 75% of 2 Corps combat strength had been tragically depleted. The withdrawal was a nightmare for the refugees as well. Of the roughly 400,000 civilians who tried to escape from Kontum, Pleiku, Phuban, and Cheoreo, only around 60,000 to 100,000 actually made it out. The scale of lost equipment was staggering as well. Hundreds of artillery pieces and armored vehicles were left behind in Pleiku or destroyed along the journey. Almost 18,000 tons of ammunition, enough for a month's supply for the Corps, remained in depots in Ban Mae Thuot, Pleiku, and Kontum. Many operational aircraft were also abandoned for the enemy at Pleiku. A former South Vietnamese general described the retreat from Pleiku as the greatest disaster in the history of ARVN. Another general echoed this sentiment, stating it must rank as one of the worst planned and executed withdrawal operations in military history. Despite how extreme these views may sound, they are true. The South Vietnamese surrendered Pleiku and Kontum with almost no resistance. Lieutenant General Phu oversaw a poorly timed and executed retreat that nearly wiped out an entire corps. Plans to reclaim Ban Mae Thuot were now unthinkable. This self-inflicted defeat, as General Vien later termed it, turned into a nightmare for the people and armed forces of South Vietnam. Confusion, anxiety, guilt, and a shared sense of distress began to haunt everyone. The South Vietnamese lost 6 provinces in a brief span, leaving their confidence deeply shaken. Arnold Isaacs, a Saigon correspondent for the Baltimore Sun, observed the chaos in it Corps and noted, "It felt as if a vital part had come undone. After enduring so much for so little gain, these soldiers had now faced a betrayal that even their remarkable resilience couldn't withstand. Abandoned by their leaders and left to navigate the disaster from Pleiku, they had lost even the opportunity to regain their pride by fighting back." It was hard to believe they would ever function as an army again. While the defeat in the Central Highlands was severe, an even greater catastrophe was unfolding 200 miles north. The commander of I Corps in military region funds was Lieutenant Ngo Quang Truong, one of Tio's finest field generals. He had built a strong defense in his operational area, and for the first 2 months of 1975 his forces performed admirably, effectively fending off Pan assaults in Quang Tri, Hue, and along Route 1. But everything shifted with the fall of Ban Mae Thuot and the calamity in 2 Corps. President Chio believed the new North Vietnamese offensive was aimed at Saigon and, upon the advice of the JGS, began reallocating forces from I Corps to safeguard the capital. In March, he instructed Truong to send the airborne division to the Saigon area immediately. Tio then conveyed to Truong that holding Da Nang was paramount, suggesting that the rest of MR1 was considered expendable. Under the impression that he was ordered to forsake most of I Corps while retaining only Da Nang, its port, and the immediate vicinity, Truong set about repositioning his troops. As South Vietnamese units withdrew from Quang Tri, local residents feared abandonment to the North Vietnamese and started to flee toward Da Nang. By March 18th, the highway was overwhelmed with terrified refugees desperate to escape. The following day, North Vietnamese forces reclaimed the remnants of Quang Tri without resistance. On that same day, Lieutenant General Truong returned to Saigon for another meeting with President Tio to address the situation. Truong expressed his intention to hold on to both Hue and Chu Lai as long as possible before making the final stand in Da Nang, which he aimed to transform into a stronghold to impede the Pa Ven advance southward. Tio begrudgingly accepted Truong's strategy. Despite Tio's lukewarm support, Truong returned to Da Nang resolute to fight a historic battle. However, during his absence, conditions had deteriorated considerably. The stream of refugees into Da Nang was increasing daily, and long-range Pa Ven artillery had begun bombarding the I Corps forward headquarters near Hue. North Vietnamese troops had overrun the local forces that were covering the South Vietnamese withdrawal from Quang Tri and were now assaulting the next ARVN defensive line along the My Chan River, which lay halfway to Hue. Additional Pa Ven forces launched an assault on the 1st ARVN Division and the 15th Ranger Group, which were spread out along Route 1 south of Hue. They also began shelling the highway, clogged with motorcycles, cars, buses, trucks, and crowds of pedestrians. At this point, South Vietnamese forces in Military Region 1 faced 5 Pa Ven main force divisions, 9 infantry regiments, 3 sapper regiments, 3 tank regiments, 8 artillery regiments, and 12 anti-aircraft regiments, almost the equivalent of 9 divisions. The Pa Ven strategy was to simultaneously strike the South Vietnamese positions in I Corps from the north, west, and south, pushing Truong's forces into Da Nang where they could be surrounded and eliminated. As the initial step, General Deng directed the B-4 Front and 2nd Army Corps to cut Route 1, isolating Hue. The indecision from Tio and the conflicting orders to Lieutenant General Truong ultimately made this task easier for the North Vietnamese. A U.S. observer described the situation to a Time magazine correspondent, saying it felt like a yo-yo. Thieu first ordered a withdrawal to defend Da Nang, but then reversed that decision and insisted on holding Hue. Soon after, he told the troops to retreat. What should have been a more orderly withdrawal turned into chaos. The order to abandon Hue was poorly received by the soldiers of the 1st ARVN Division, many of whom had family in the area. Brigadier General Nguyen Van Diem, the division commander, told his troops, "We've been betrayed. We must abandon Hue. It's every man for himself. See you in Da Nang." Following this guidance, the division's withdrawal quickly descended into a fiasco. The coastal roads were already choked with civilian refugees, and as the chain of command broke down under Brigadier General Diem's orders, many ARVN soldiers disappeared into the crowd, searching for their families. While this disaster unfolded, the Pa Ven entered the citadel in Hue without facing resistance. The retreat from Hue in late March became a calamitous event comparable in scope to the earlier disaster in the highlands. The South Vietnamese forces had entered the battle in northern I Corps in relatively good shape, and many soldiers and Marines fought bravely, but the confusing orders that led to the abandonment of strong defensive positions left the troops demoralized. Poor leadership, a breakdown in unit integrity and discipline, along with worries about family, quickly spiraled into panic and chaos. The situation got so out of hand that the troops didn't even attempt to destroy the weapons and equipment they left behind. One officer reported abandoning 37 tanks, all fueled and ready to go, on the beach as he and his men hurried to the boats. Another senior officer arriving at Da Nang captured the mood when he told a reporter, "I don't even know where my wife and kids are. Why should I worry about my division?" Only about a third of the troops made it to Da Nang, and countless civilians lost their lives in the frantic evacuation. The 1st ARVN Division, once the pride of the army, was effectively lost as a cohesive unit and never regrouped. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General Truong faced PAVN attacks in southern MR1s, where conditions were also dire. The Communists seized Tam Khe, the capital of Quang Tin Province, on March 24th. Further south, they intensified their assaults on Quang Ngai Province, cutting Route 1 between the city of Quang Ngai and Chu Lai. Back in Da Nang, the situation deteriorated even further. The city was besieged from the north by 2 PAVN divisions, bolstered by a tank regiment and 2 artillery regiments, while 2 more reinforced divisions attacked the district towns of Duc Duc and Dai Loc from the south. As the North Vietnamese closed in from all directions, the massive crowd of military and civilian residents within the city was thrown into total disarray. With Da Nang, a city of 300,000, overwhelmed by nearly 2 million refugees from Quang Tri, Hue, and Quang Tin, the chaos intensified. Thousands of stragglers and deserters took advantage of the situation, preying on refugees and looting the city. A high-ranking officer from I Corps later described Da Nang as being seized by convulsions of collective hysteria. The chaos was such that, according to Major Gen. Homer Smith from the U.S. Defense Attach Office in Saigon, the pandemonium which overtook reason in Da Nang literally wrested control of the city from all official presence. Order and discipline completely broke down. An effort to organize a massive airlift was thwarted when crowds of refugees overwhelmed the airfield, mobbing the planes as they tried to take off. From Saigon, Teo sought to rally his forces. On March 26th, he took to the radio and issued an urgent order of the day, imploring his soldiers to halt the enemy advance at all costs. He declared, "I've guided you through many perilous situations before. This time I stand beside you once more, ready to fight and win together." Unfortunately, the troops and civilians in I Corps had long given up on rallying, and Chiu's call had little impact. As darkness descended, the North Vietnamese shelled Da Nang Airport and the naval base while simultaneously targeting the I Corps command post and other vital military positions in the city. Despite attempts at counter-battery fire from the ARVN 175mm guns, their efforts were largely ineffective, and the PAVN continued their bombardment. Under this relentless assault, what remained of Da Nang's defenses crumbled, prompting Lieutenant General Truong to contact President Teo, urging immediate evacuation of the city. General Vien reports that while Teo was deeply concerned about the dire situation, he remained vague in his response to Truong's plea. The president seemed hesitant to repeat the disaster experienced in the Central Highlands, yet, as before, he did not clearly guide the I Corps commander on how to proceed. Once Lieutenant General Truong hung up the phone, the North Vietnamese shelling cut off all communication lines between Da Nang and Saigon. Believing the situation was beyond salvaging, Truong resolved to withdraw the remnants of his forces from Da Nang. He ordered his troops to move to 3 embarkation points for evacuation by sea. At dawn on March 29th, the evacuation began. A thick fog enveloped the coast, and with the tide low, the ships could not reach the beach. Although the troops had to wade and swim to the vessels, the initial loading went smoothly. However, by mid-morning, PAVN artillery began raining down on the beaches, turning the operation into a chaotic escape. It mirrored the disaster at Hue, as thousands of soldiers and civilians rushed toward the sea, many drowning in their attempt to reach the safety of the ships. Countless others fell victim to the continued artillery fire. In the end, only about 50,000 of the 2 million civilian refugees managed to escape Da Nang. Approximately 6,000 Marines and 4,000 soldiers reached the rescue ships, but in Truong's words, not many others got out. By March 30th, the PAVN took control of Da Nang and seized all of Military Region 1, capturing over 100,000 South Vietnamese soldiers in the process. Notably, there were no major battles in the I Corps area before Da Nang fell. The South Vietnamese military largely ceased to operate effectively. Among the 50,000 troops in and around the city, few raised their weapons to defend it. One observer noted that Da Nang was not captured, it disintegrated in its own terror. Confronted with a superior enemy and grappling with poor leadership, lack of discipline, rumors, contradictory orders, and concern for their families, most South Vietnamese soldiers abandoned the fight and looked out for themselves. One senior officer detailed how stragglers mingled with the local population, boarding civilian boats and ships. Frustrated, starving, and without guidance, they descended into chaos, engaging in unacceptable acts of theft. Billions of dollars worth of equipment was destroyed or left behind for the enemy. Thus, the second largest city in Vietnam fell, going through a phase of madness before succumbing. By April 1st, the PAVN controlled all of MR1s and most of MR2. In capturing these regions, they decimated 2 ARVN corps, crippling over half of ARVN's effective fighting strength. The 22nd ARVN Division held its ground in MR2, overseeing the cities of Quy Nhon, Tuy Hoa, and Nha Trang, but they were eventually overrun as North Vietnamese reinforcements arrived from the north. The ARVN defenders were evacuated by sea, with around 2,000 officers and men escaping. By mid-April, the North Vietnamese eradicated the remaining pockets of RVNF resistance, and the remaining coastal provinces fell like a row of porcelain vases sliding off a shelf. The loss of military regions 1 and 2 shook South Vietnam to its core, with half the nation given away with minimal resistance. The fall of Da Nang, the country's second largest city, was described by South Vietnam's Deputy Premier Dr. Phan Quang Dan as the worst single disaster in the history of South Vietnam. In addition to losing territory, the South Vietnamese, in their panic, left behind vast quantities of ammunition, supplies, and equipment as the North Vietnamese advanced. At the Quy Nhon Depot alone, over 4,410 tons of ammunition were discarded. The VNAF abandoned 33 A-37 jet fighters on the runway at Da Nang and nearly 60 aircraft at Phu Cat Air Base. The evacuation of the northern 2 military regions, as General Philip Davidson described, devolved into a frantic scramble for safety. On some rare occasions, South Vietnamese troops, under capable leadership, fought bravely, demonstrating both skill and courage. However, for the most part, soldiers mirrored their leaders, who more often than not were quick to flee the battlefield. The army disintegrated, as one observer noted, like a house with its timbers eaten away by termites, still appearing sound until the moment it collapses. Since the start of Vietnamization, the existence of the South Vietnamese armed forces was always uncertain. Previously, the question had been how many years they could endure, but now it shifted to how many weeks they would continue to fight. Witnessing the northern half of South Vietnam falling and realizing that Thieu and his forces were in dire straits, the Politburo in Hanoi decided they didn't need to wait until 1976 to launch the final offensive. General Giap recognized that the timing was right for a decisive strike. He determined that the likelihood of U.S. intervention was low, and that the South Vietnamese forces, suffering losses of over a battalion a day, were too weakened to withstand the increasingly powerful forces of the Vietnam Revolution, both militarily and politically. Le Duan, the party first secretary, concurred with Giap, and together they persuaded their colleagues to crush the puppet regime with a significant campaign aimed at ending the war. On March 25th, the Politburo instructed General Deng to leap forward to seize a once-in-a-thousand-years opportunity to liberate Saigon before the rainy season, ensuring the reunification of the fatherland. In response to these orders, Deng rapidly advanced his forces over 1,000 miles down the coast, achieving one of the most monumental and intricate maneuvers of the war. Large groups of soldiers, vehicles, and equipment, much of it taken from the South Vietnamese, advanced down the coastal highway towards Saigon. Other units were approaching the city from the west and south. On April 3rd, General Deng reached his new command post just west of Loc Ninh, a mere 65 miles north of Saigon. By then, he had 16 infantry divisions at his command, aided by tanks, sappers, artillery, and anti-aircraft units, all organized into 5 corps. As these forces prepared for their assault, Deng and his team finalized their strategies for what would be known as the Ho Chi Minh Campaign. While Deng was rallying his troops, Thieu was assessing the South Vietnamese forces ready to defend the capital. This included 3 divisions from ARVN 3 Corps and 3 from 4 Corps, along with remnants of the Marine and Airborne divisions, several armor battalions, depleted ranger groups, and survivors from previous defeats. totaling around 60,000 troops. The South Vietnamese were clearly outmatched, but raw numbers don't tell the whole story. While the North Vietnamese, riding a wave of success, intensified their attacks, the RVNAF were disorganized, demoralized, and already showing signs of a defeated army before the decisive battle for Saigon even began. The civilian population was equally distressed by the seemingly endless victories of the North, which one despairing government official likened to an avalanche. Unfortunately, the fear and hardship didn't unite the people behind their government or military. Instead, the focus appeared to be on individual survival. A journalist observing the rising panic in Saigon remarked that no spirit of support or sacrifice has been summoned. While South Vietnamese citizens at all levels were frightened of a communist takeover, most took little action to prevent it. Fear began to spread among the population, civil servants, and military personnel. Catholics and those associated with supporting or working alongside Americans were particularly alarmed. Ironically, statements from U.S. officials only amplified the growing hysteria. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, speaking to the Senate Appropriations Committee, stated that those considered seriously endangered in Vietnam included anyone involved in the South Vietnamese government, its legislative bodies, police forces, and those who worked with the United States in various programs. Defense Secretary James Schlesinger warned that up to 200,000 Vietnamese could be killed in a communist takeover. These remarks were widely reported in Saigon, escalating fear and desperation. While the past actions of the communists, such as the Hue Massacre, warranted concern, the level of fear gripping South Vietnamese society was an extreme overreaction, leading to a near-complete paralysis in their defense of the city. The situation worsened as rumors emerged about the U.S. planning to evacuate Americans from Saigon. Ambassador Martin sought to quell these rumors, insisting that with more support, the South Vietnamese could stabilize the situation. His deputy, Wolfgang Lehmann, remarked at an embassy meeting shortly after the fall of Da Nang that he believed the North Vietnamese lacked the military capability to launch an assault on Saigon. This claim was utterly ridiculous. By the first week of April, only a few small areas in Phan Rang and Phan Thiet remained under South Vietnamese control, with two-thirds of the South now under North Vietnamese dominance. 6 of the 13 ARVN divisions had disappeared, along with many troops from various units. The losses in weapons, vehicles, aircraft, supplies, and gear were immense. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese, racking up victories, moved toward Saigon largely unscathed. General Dung noted that casualties were minimal compared to their successes, and the use of weapons and ammunition was slight. The Ford administration was taken aback by the rapid collapse of South Vietnamese forces in Y and Tout Corps. On March 22nd, President Ford had reassured Thieu of his commitment to support the Republic of Vietnam during this critical time. To honor the United States' responsibilities in this situation, I am urgently consulting with my advisors about the actions that may be necessary and legally permissible. On March 25th, as Hue fell to the Communists, Thieu replied with a letter highlighting the grave military conditions and urging the United States to fulfill its promise to safeguard the peace in Vietnam. He specifically asked Ford to authorize a short but intense B-52 airstrike against enemy troops and supply bases in South Vietnam, and to urgently supply the means needed to contain and repel the offensive. Ford responded with a letter assuring Thieu of his ongoing strong support and his commitment to help the Republic of Vietnam. He also expressed confidence in their joint efforts for success. Ford requested a first-hand evaluation of the military situation and sent Army Chief of Staff Frederick Weyand to Saigon. However, Thieu, as reported by his close advisor Nguyen Tien Hung, was not convinced by Ford's reassurances. Thieu felt that Ford and his team were downplaying the seriousness of the crisis and pulling back from earlier commitments. He complained, "Ford doesn't seem to care. He is going off on vacation to Palm Springs while we are dying. When is he going to respond?" Weyand arrived in Saigon on March 27th, met with President Thieu, and assured him of President Ford's steadfast support. After discussions with Ambassador Martin and Major General Smith, Wyan spent the next 6 days assessing the military situation and inspecting various locations across South Vietnam. Before leaving Saigon, he told Thieu, "We will get you the assistance you need and will explain your needs to Congress." Upon returning to the United States on April 4th, Wyan met with the president the following day in Palm Springs. While he felt deeply pessimistic about the circumstances, he shared with Ford that he believed one more infusion of funding and arms might somehow help American goals in South Vietnam. He stated that the government of the Republic of Vietnam was on the edge of a complete military defeat, yet the South Vietnamese were combating fiercely with all their resources. Wyan noted that while they couldn't recover lost territory, acquiring more ammunition and equipment would likely allow them to set up a solid defense around Saigon. He suggested that Ford seek an additional aid request from Congress for $722 million to replace the materials lost during the chaotic retreat from I and II Corps. According to Wyan's evaluation, this equipment could help outfit 8 infantry and ranger divisions, along with another 27 independent regiments made up of existing territorial forces, creating a force close to the communist troops advancing toward Saigon. Wyan argued that besides fulfilling the material needs of the RVNAF, this supplementary request would also uplift the South Vietnamese people's spirits, who were very close to falling into despair and defeatism, potentially undermining their entire structure. However, there were conflicting views within the administration regarding Wyan's proposal and the wisdom of seeking any additional aid for Saigon. Many of the president's advisors believed Congress would likely reject such a request. One memo from that time remarked that any call for supplementary military aid would probably be met with outright refusal, highlighting strong criticism of the ARVN for abandoning supplies and the treatment of women and children during the retreat. Ford's aides, after consulting with Congress, informed him that many lawmakers wouldn't support him, and some would actively oppose any new aid requests. Some advisors doubted that the South Vietnamese could hold out long enough for aid to arrive, even if a miracle occurred and Congress approved the funds. They referred to a Defense Intelligence Agency report from April 3rd that estimated South Vietnam only had 30 days left. Nonetheless, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, always aware of the implications of American actions, urged Ford to pursue the full $722 million proposed by General Wyan, to send a message not just to South Vietnam, but also to America's allies worldwide, affirming that the United States would uphold its commitments. Given the escalating crisis in South Vietnam, Ford faced a tough challenge in persuading Congress to increase funding for the region. On April 3rd, during a press conference, the president remarked that 55,000 American lives had been lost due to Congress's failure to uphold commitments made in the Paris Agreement. He stated, "It is up to the American people to judge who should bear the blame." This remark infuriated many lawmakers. Senator Richard Byrd responded, "Some commitments are fabricated where none exist, and Congress is then held accountable for not fulfilling them." On April 8th, Senator Henry Jackson accused Nixon of making secret agreements in writing without consulting Congress and demanded clarification on these promises. The Ford administration countered that Nixon had not made any private promises that he hadn't already made publicly. This held true to Ford's knowledge at that moment, as evidence indicates that he had not yet reviewed the complete file of Nixon-Thieu correspondence. Despite Ford's assurances, many in Congress remained convinced there was a covert arrangement with Thieu. At this point, President Ford, despite objections from domestic advisor Robert Hartman and Press Secretary Ron Nessen, but supported by Henry Kissinger, addressed a joint session of Congress on April 10th to request a military aid supplement of $722 million and an additional $250 million for economic support and refugee assistance. Ford asserted that the current situation in South Vietnam stemmed from uncertainty regarding further American assistance, stressing that the reduction in aid showed our growing reluctance to support a nation fighting for its survival. He urged Congress to help him uphold America's commitments around the world. The president maintained that the support for Saigon must be swift and sufficient, warning that inaction would result in greater disaster. He requested Congress to approve the bill by April 19th, just 9 days away. Any doubts about Congress's likely reaction to the new aid request were quickly dispelled when there was no applause after Ford's appeal for additional support for Saigon, and 2 Democrats even left during his speech. Despite the administration's attempts, the request for additional aid was doomed from the start. The situation in Cambodia only complicated matters further. The Communist Khmer Rouge had been close to completely taking over Cambodia for a while. Just 2 hours before the president addressed Congress, Ambassador John Gunther Dean sent a cable from Phnom Penh asking to start Operation Eagle Pull, the final phase of the American evacuation from the Cambodian capital. The end of U.S. involvement in Cambodia, which spanned 5 years and cost over $1 billion, came on the morning of April 17 when the victorious Khmer Rouge entered Phnom Penh. As Congress deliberated the president's military aid request, the impending fall of Cambodia and the ongoing crisis in South Vietnam cast a shadow over the proceedings. As White House aides predicted, even former supporters of U.S. policy in South Vietnam, like Senator Byrd, opposed new aid for Saigon. Byrd stated that any extra military support for either Cambodia or South Vietnam would end up in the hands of those we were currently opposing, and he expressed significant doubt that any additional spending, aside from humanitarian efforts, would change the unfolding situation. Other legislators were even more forceful. Representative Bella Abzug wrote to the president, accusing the U.S. government of wrong policies and illegal military intervention for the past decade, which she claimed had largely created the tragic circumstances facing the South Vietnamese. She insisted that Ford immediately halt all military aid to the discredited government of President Thieu. Administration officials faced a frosty reception during the congressional hearings on the aid request. Secretary of State Kissinger testified before the House Appropriations Committee, stating that South Vietnam had no other options. Without our assistance, it had no hope of even slowing down the events it had bravely resisted for years. He cautioned that projecting an image of abandoning those who had allied with us would harm our standing internationally. However, these warnings fell on deaf ears. Congress rejected the president's request and shifted its focus to the anticipated evacuation of U.S. citizens. When the administration sought permission to bypass legal restrictions on military force to evacuate Vietnamese citizens who had aided the United States, liberals in Congress reacted vehemently. In the House of Representatives, Bella Abzug emphatically stated, "This legislation is simply a way for the United States to keep its presence in Vietnam and to potentially use military force to maintain control. If we disapprove of the situation, we could become involved again, akin to a new Gulf of Tonkin resolution." It was evident that South Vietnam would receive no more assistance from the United States. During a nationally broadcast speech on April 4th, a disheartened and frustrated Thieu blamed everyone for the military setbacks, citing betrayal by Montagnard troops, cowardly behavior in the armed forces, foreign meddling, and even the influence of broadcasts from media outlets like the BBC and Voice of America. Rather than taking accountability, he criticized the United States for not keeping their promises to aid South Vietnam, as 2 presidents had pledged. He questioned, "Can we trust U.S. commitments and do their words hold any weight?" After harshly rebuking the Americans, Thieu declared that only the United States could provide the miracle needed for salvation. He warned that if American support continued to trickle in, we will gradually lose our land to the North Vietnamese communists until we lose it all. Therefore, I hope the American people and Congress will recognize the true situation and the repercussions of their actions over the past 2 years and assist us in a more practical, timely, effective, and sufficient way so we can defend our territory. Unfortunately, that was not to be. The depth of Thieu's plight and that of his nation became all too apparent on April 8th, when First Lieutenant Than Trung, a VNAF F-5E fighter pilot, executed 2 bombing runs on Independence Palace, then flew to the Ph occupied airfield at Phuoc Long, where he was greeted as a hero. Thieu, who had long been anxious about the threat of a coup, found himself nearly paralyzed by the attack on the palace, which was later determined to be a singular incident and not a coup attempt. Yet, it clearly signaled that the situation was beginning to fall apart. While Chiu fretted over potential coups and President Ford, along with his advisors, clashed with Congress, General Deng and his team were making the final preparations for the Ho Chi Minh campaign. Deng's strategy involved a three-pronged assault on Saigon. The primary attack would come from the east, led by the 4th Army Corps, which included the 6th, 7th, and 341st Divisions. These forces were to leave their positions in Tai Ninh and Bin Long provinces, moving easterly along the foothills of the southern highlands, taking Lam Dong province and then advancing to capture Xuan Loc, the capital of Long Can province and a vital ARVN stronghold defending Saigon along Route 1. To tie down the South Vietnamese forces defending Saigon and prevent them from reinforcing Xuan Loc, the newly formed 232nd Tactical Force, comprising 4 PAV-N divisions, would come up from the Delta and cut Route 4. Meanwhile, the 3rd Army Corps was to ramp up attacks in the Tay Ninh area to keep the 25th ARVN Division occupied and divert attention from the eastern move of the 4th Army Corps. By April 8th, the 4th Army Corps had positioned itself around Xuan Loc. The following day, the 341st Division initiated the main assault from the northwest, following a barrage of 4,000 rounds of mortars, artillery, and rockets that ignited much of the city. Supporting attacks came from the north-northeast and east by the 7th and 6th Divisions, respectively. With T-54 tanks leading the charge, the 341st Division moved into the heart of the city. By dawn the next day, the North Vietnamese had secured the police station, the CIA compound, and the local ranger base. However, the 18th ARVN Division, under Brig Gen Le Minh Dao, put up a fierce fight, engaging in hand-to-hand combat in many instances. One reason the soldiers fought so valiantly was their strong leadership. Brigadier General Dao and his officers stood firm and fought alongside their men, a stark contrast to the earlier failures in MRs I and II. Additionally, the soldiers were motivated to fight hard, knowing that their family members had mostly been evacuated to Saigon before the main battle commenced. On the morning of April 10th, ARVN forces launched a counterattack, pushing the PAN back. Major General Ly Trong An, commander of the North Vietnamese Corps, ordered backup regiments from the 6th and 7th Divisions to join the fight, yet the ARVN tenaciously maintained their positions in and around Xuan Loc. Deng, who had grown used to advancing without resistance, was struck by the stubbornness of the enemy. The Joint General Staff recognized that Dao and his troops had a chance to halt the North Vietnamese advance and quickly sent reinforcements from the 25th ARVN Division and the 1st Airborne Brigade to the Xuan Loc area. Over 25,000 ARVN troops were now dedicated to defending Xuan Loc, nearly a third of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam still in existence. With VNAF providing close air support, the 18th ARVN soldiers began to gain the upper hand in the conflict. Buoyed by the RVF's determined stand, Major General Smith informed the Joint Chiefs that the South Vietnamese won Round 1 in the battle for Xuan Loc. He praised the valor and aggressiveness of GVN troops and suggested that their performance seemed to answer the question, will ARVN fight? Meanwhile, General Deng, eager to avoid being bogged down in a peripheral battle near Saigon, urged his forces to intensify their efforts to eliminate the defenders. He sent in more reinforcements and instructed the 2nd Army Corps, which was capturing Phan Rang, to continue south along the coast to seize Phan Thiet, then shift west to assault Xuan Loc if the South Vietnamese still controlled the city upon their arrival. The clashes that followed were fiercely contested on both sides. The 18th ARVN Division showed great bravery, but by April 15th, overwhelming numbers and superior firepower began to shift the momentum. Brigadier General Dao had to evacuate his troops from within the city. On April 16th, helicopters rescued the survivors of the 43rd Regiment. That same day, the PAVN finally overpowered the 52nd Regiment, which had by then lost 70% of its original strength. The North Vietnamese captured Xuan Loc, marking what would become the last major battle of the war. Once Xuan Loc fell, there was nothing left between the North Vietnamese forces and Saigon. Le Gros, who observed the battle at Xuan Loc, remarked that the South Vietnamese had fought admirably, forcing the PAN leadership to treat the conflict like a meat grinder, sacrificing its own forces to eliminate critical ARVN troops. The 18th ARVN Division held strong for 3 weeks against overwhelming odds, destroying 37 Pan tanks and claiming over 5,000 enemy lives. If the rest of the South Vietnamese had fought with the same courage as the 18th ARVN, the war's outcome might have been remarkably different. On April 16th, Thieu dispatched Nguyen Tien Hung to Washington as his personal messenger to advocate for Saigon's cause one final time. Hung carried with him a file containing letters from Nixon and Ford that pledged support for the South Vietnamese. His task was to request a loan of $3 billion annually for 3 years, with the interest rate to be decided by Congress. In a letter delivered to Ford, Thieu referred to this assistance as a freedom loan, one that would allow them to defend against aggressors and provide a fair chance at survival as a free nation. Thieu believed he could still maintain resistance against the communists in the Mekong Delta if he received ongoing American backing. Hung later admitted he was sent to play the part of a cabinet minister turned beggar. Regrettably for the South Vietnamese, there was no time left, even for pleading. On April 17th, the administration's final request for aid was effectively quashed when the Senate Armed Services Committee voted against additional support for Saigon. Though discussions continued in other committees, it was a moot point. Hung later expressed his shock upon hearing the Armed Services Committee's decision, as his mission crumbled due to no one to converse with about the freedom loan. Thieu's situation had become increasingly precarious. On April 18th, PVN sappers targeted the Phu Lam radar station near Saigon. Lieutenant General Tuan, the 3 Corps commander, called to update the president about the worsening situation. He confirmed that the defense at Xuan Loc was on the brink of collapse and that Phan Rang had fallen. He also informed Thieu that ARVN soldiers had bulldozed and leveled Thieu's ancestral graveyard outside Phan Rang. This act was a significant insult, illustrating just how far Thieu had fallen in the eyes of his fellow countrymen. Lam Quang Thi noted that Thieu had earned the title of the most hated man in Vietnam. On April 18th, a coalition of political moderates and opposition figures confronted Thieu, warning him that they would publicly demand his resignation if he didn't step down voluntarily within 6 days. In response, Thieu ordered the arrest of several senior military officers, including Lieutenant General Phu, the commander of 2 Corps, insisting they bore more blame for the military disaster than he did. General Dong Van Quyen later reflected that Thieu had held on to the hope that the Americans would not allow him or his countrymen to suffer defeat, but he eventually came to understand that time was up. His capital was encircled by the North Vietnamese army, public support had dwindled, and it became painfully obvious to everyone that the U.S. had abandoned both Thieu and South Vietnam. On the evening of April 20th, Ambassador Martin met with President Cho, bringing along the most recent CIA intelligence report, which painted a grim picture. While Martin refrained from directly telling Thieu he should resign, he suggested, as a friend, that the choice to leave office rested solely with Thieu. The president listened quietly and promised the ambassador he would do what is best for the country. Later that day, French Ambassador Jean-Marie Marion informed Thieu of rumors that certain generals were prepared to push him out if he did not resign. There's some debate about whether there was a genuine plot to oust Thieu. General Vienne, the Joint General Staff Chairman, later insisted that Marion was mistaken. He claimed there was no pressure from any general to force Thieu out. However, Vienne did admit to meeting with a group that included Defense Minister Tran Van Don, Prime Minister Nguyen Ba Can, and Economics Minister Nguyen Van Hao, insisting their gathering was to discuss the current situation and not to conspire against Thieu. Regardless of the discussions, the following day, to preempt any potential removal, Thieu summoned key members of his government to Independence Palace, where he began by recounting his conversations with ambassadors Martin and Marion. He announced that he would make his decision based on their reactions and whether they viewed him as a barrier to peace. Silence fell in the room. Presidential advisor Hung noted that Thieu came to the conclusion to resign at that moment. The following day, Thieu addressed a joint session of the National Assembly. In a 3-hour speech, broadcasted nationwide, He passionately criticized the United States for not fulfilling its promises. The United States has failed to keep its word. It's inhumane. It's untrustworthy. It's irresponsible, he declared. Comparing the recent congressional debate over supplemental aid to bargaining at the fish market, he added, "I must not allow others to barter over the lives of our soldiers." He then announced his resignation and handed over power to Vice President Tran Van Huang. He concluded with a heartfelt message: "I leave today, and I ask my fellow countrymen, the armed forces and religious groups to forgive the mistakes I made during my time in power. The country and I are grateful to you. I don't deserve this. I am resigning, but I am not abandoning my post." By the time Huang took office, the North Vietnamese were advancing closer to Saigon and showed no interest in negotiating with the new president or anyone else. The official North Vietnamese news agency dismissed the leadership change as a puppet show and labeled the new administration as the Thieu regime without Thieu. At this point, American focus shifted to evacuation efforts. On April 23rd, President Ford spoke at Tulane University in New Orleans, stating, "America can reclaim the pride that existed before Vietnam, but that cannot happen by reliving a war that's over for America." On the same day, Ambassador Martin informed Kissinger that it would soon be time to carry out Operation Frequent Wind, the American evacuation of Saigon. While the new South Vietnamese government desperately sought a way to save Saigon, General Deng and his team were finalizing plans for the imminent assault. Deng's strategy, a variation of the blossoming lotus tactic that had worked well at Bon Methot, aimed to swiftly seize 5 crucial locations in the city: Independence Palace, Joint General Staff Headquarters, the National Police Headquarters, Tan Son Nhut Air Base, and the Special Capital Zone Headquarters, which commanded the ARVN troops safeguarding the city. Deng believed that once these crucial nerve centers were destroyed, the Saigon army and administration would be like a headless snake. Their defense and control would crumble, the people would rise up, and Saigon would be swiftly freed. Saigon was defended by remnants of 5 ARVN divisions stationed in a circle 30 to 50 kilometers from the city center. Deng aimed to avoid a lengthy battle with these forces and did not want them retreating into the city, where his troops would have to engage in street fighting, so he proposed splitting his forces. While one part would hold the ARVN troops on the outskirts, another would push towards the city center. To support this strategy, he intended to send troops to secure the main roads, bridges, and key spots leading into Saigon, paving the way for an armored thrust aimed at essential installations. Simultaneously, he planned to deploy artillery, a battery of SA-2 anti-aircraft missiles, and a collection of captured A-37 bombers to neutralize Tan Son Nhut Air Base. Deng scheduled the perimeter attacks for April 26th, with the main city assault following on the next day. After finalizing the strategy, he ordered his forces, now over 130,000 strong, into offensive positions. The 4th Army Corps, having taken Xuan Loc and Trang Bom, would advance down Route 1 from the east to hit Bien Hoa and then Saigon itself. The 2nd Army Corps moved along Route 2 toward Ba Ria and Vung Tau. In the southwest, the 232nd Tactical Force and several independent regiments prepared to engage the ARVN positions along Route 4 to cut off Saigon's access from the Mekong Delta. In the northwest, the 3rd Army Corps readied to confront the 25th ARVN Division along Route 1 near Trang Bang and Cu Chi. As the other corps completed their maneuvers, the 3 reserve divisions of the 1st Army Corps gathered at assembly points east of Ben Cat. The decisive battle for the future of the Republic of South Vietnam was about to commence. On April 26th, the North Vietnamese commenced supporting attacks using the 6th, 7th, and 341st Divisions against Bien Hoa and the former U.S. base at Long Binh. At the same time, the 304 and 325th Divisions targeted ARVN positions at Long Than, aiming to sever Route 15, the last land route connecting Saigon to Vung Tau on the coast. The 312th Gold Star Division launched an assault on Ba Ria, located at the tip of the Vung Tau Peninsula. These offensives were designed to keep ARVN forces occupied, preventing them from sending reinforcements to Saigon as the city faced an imminent onslaught. In the early hours of April 27th, the North Vietnamese main assault on Saigon commenced. While communist troops advanced on the city, South Vietnamese leaders were caught up in a debate over the country's leadership. Many anticipated that President Hoang would soon step down, allowing a stronger figure to either spearhead the resistance against the communists or negotiate peace. However, Hoang had yet to do so. He was well-intentioned but unwell, struggling to meet the pressing demands of the situation. Under increasing pressure to resign, Hoang eventually stated that out of respect for the Constitution, if the National Assembly no longer wished for him to be president, it was up to them to vote him out. The Assembly countered, saying it was Hoang's responsibility to resign. Simultaneously, fierce discussions erupted in the Assembly among those advocating for Duong Van Minh, traditional supporters of Thieu, and others who believed Air Vice Marshal Nguyen Cao Ky should assume the presidency to continue the fight. While these discussions unfolded, the North Vietnamese army continued to tighten their grip around Saigon. Finally, on April 27th, just after 4 PAVN rockets struck the city, Hoang summoned the National Assembly to select a political leader to succeed the head of state and conduct negotiations with the other side. At 6:45 p.m., Senate President Tran Van Lam convened the assembly and read a letter from President Hoang. Acknowledging the dire circumstances, Hoang declared, "We are lost," and expressed that they had no choice but to negotiate, announcing his readiness to hand over power to General Minh, who had long claimed connections within the communist ranks. Following the letter, Defense Minister Tran Van Don, along with General Vien and Gen. Nguyen Van Minh, the commander of Saigon defenses, briefed on the grim military situation. Not long after, the Assembly, with a third of its members abstaining, voted to appoint Minh as president, tasking him with the mission of finding ways to restore peace to South Vietnam. Those who supported Minh believed he could leverage his connections to initiate talks with the North Vietnamese. However, such hopes were unrealistic. The communists had the advantage on the battlefield, and a decisive victory was imminent. The Politburo had unanimously ruled out any possibility of a negotiated settlement, regardless of changes in Saigon's political landscape. On the morning of April 28th, commandos from the PAVN's 4th Army Corps seized the far end of the Newport Bridge, just 5 kilometers from downtown Saigon, effectively cutting off the last land route between the capital and Bien Hoa. For days, PAVN infiltrators had been blending in with the waves of refugees fleeing the fighting, entering the city and regrouping in teams of 10 to 15. Each team was assigned specific targets, including critical installations like barracks, munition depots, and police stations. These teams were poised to act as the main PAVN forces commenced their offensive on Saigon. Other infiltrators were tasked with guarding bridges to prevent the South Vietnamese from obstructing the advance of PAVN tanks and armored units into the city. An Italian journalist later recounted that a senior North Vietnamese officer disclosed that over 1,500 commandos infiltrated Saigon in the week leading up to the South Vietnamese surrender. At 5:15 p.m. on April 28th, as the North Vietnamese finalized their preparations for the assault on Saigon, President Hoang officially resigned in a ceremony at Independence Palace. Addressing Minh, Hoang stated, "General, your mission is significant, but if you earnestly work to save the country and strive for peace while preventing further bloodshed, your contributions will be remembered by future generations." When Minh took the stage, he remarked, "I cannot offer you promises. The days ahead will present us with severe challenges. The decisions we face are serious and consequential, and our situation is precarious." He paused briefly, and one journalist later noted that he and his peers believed Minh was about to announce a surrender. However, the new president went on to say, "Our soldiers are ordered to hold their ground, to defend their positions, and protect the territory that remains ours with all their strength." He then stated, "I take full responsibility for pursuing a ceasefire, for negotiations, for achieving peace based on the Paris Accords. I'm open to any proposals in this regard." As a sign of goodwill, he declared that all political prisoners would be released and restrictions on the press would be lifted. He wrapped up by urging those considering fleeing the country to stay here with us and those of goodwill to help build a better South for the future. Just as Min concluded his speech, 5 captured A-37s launched an attack on Tan Son Nhut, destroying 3 AC-119s and several C-47s. This marked the only North Vietnamese airstrike of the war. A North Vietnamese colonel later detailed the operation to Italian journalist Tiziano Terzani. The planes took off from and returned to Phan Rang. Trung, the same pilot who bombed the Independence Palace, led the squadron. He was well acquainted with the airport and its defenses. For a week, we trained the other 4 pilots, who were used to flying MiGs. During the attack, we maintained radio silence to avoid detection. We knew surprise would be crucial. As a result, we successfully hit many enemy planes still on the ground. The puppets believed we couldn't strike the airport because our comrades were still at Camp Davis. We deliberated for a long time before giving the go-ahead for the operation, but it was necessary. The Air Force was Saigon's last line of defense, and attacking Tan Son Nhut and Bien Hoa was essential. The airstrike on Tan Son Nhut served as a response to Min's call for negotiations. However, within an hour of Min's speech, the Communists broadcast their reply over radio liberation. After the departure of the traitor Nguyen Van Thieu, the ones taking his place, namely Duong Van Minh, Nguyen Van Huyen, and Vu Van Mao, are clinging to their war, trying to keep their territories while calling for negotiations. It's clear that this group is stubbornly prolonging the conflict to preserve American neocolonialism. They aren't fooling anyone. The fighting will continue until all of Saigon's forces have laid down their arms, and all American warships have left South Vietnamese waters. Our 2 conditions must be satisfied before any ceasefire. While North Vietnamese pilots attacked Tan Son Nhut, the South Vietnamese were handing over control to General Min. Pa Ven forces positioned themselves for the decisive assault on Saigon. To the southeast, the 325th Pa Ven Division advanced to Nam Trach, where its long-range 130mm guns could hit Tan Son Nhut. To the west, another Pa Ven Division under Majid Gen D Tien Thich concealed itself during the daylight, then moved into attacking positions along the Van Co River as night fell. Dung later remarked, there was no longer any safe place for government forces. To the east of Saigon, after an overnight artillery bombardment, the final attack on Bien Hoa commenced. Lieutenant Gen Nguyen Van Tuan, commander of ARVN 3 Corps, had already departed Bien Hoa for Saigon, and when the artillery fire erupted, the rest of Tuan's staff followed suit. Time magazine reported that Tuan had privately acknowledged the battle for Saigon was lost, and quoted a U.S. military observer who noted that most ARVN leaders had nearly resigned themselves to defeat. Their morale and their leadership was just evaporating. This situation had a devastating effect on what was meant to be the climactic battle for Saigon. A young pilot from the South Vietnamese Air Force later shared, "We, the young ones, we expected to keep fighting. But how could we fight when there were no generals left to lead us?" Early in the morning on April 29th, the North Vietnamese launched a rocket attack on Tan Son Nhut, resulting in the deaths of 2 U.S. Marine security guards. L.C. Pell Darwin Judge and Charles McMahon, Jr. became the last American servicemen to die in the Vietnam War. The rocket strike was followed by shelling from the long-range 130mm guns near Nam Trach. Chaos erupted as South Vietnamese soldiers and airmen scrambled to board any aircraft available. In one instance, the crew of an already overloaded C-130 pushed soldiers off the rear ramp to gain enough speed for takeoff. Another aircraft, a C-7 Caribou transport, veered off the runway, crashed, and burned. VNF pilots jumped into whatever could fly and headed to Thailand, marking the disintegration of the Vietnamese Air Force. Ultimately, 132 aircraft made it to Utapao Air Base in Thailand. Later that day, Lieutenant Gen Tran Van Minh, the commander of the VNAF, along with a group of 30 senior Air Force officers, rushed into the DAO compound at Tan Son Nhut, demanding immediate evacuation. Major General Smith instructed his assistant air attaché, Lieutenant Colonel Dick Martin, to warn the officers they would be shot unless they surrendered their weapons and settled down. They complied, and Martin secured them in a nearby office. They were later evacuated. The DAO later assessed that this event marked a complete breakdown of command within the Air Force and highlighted the worsening chaos of an already unstable situation. While panic gripped Tan Son Nhut, President Ford held a meeting with his advisors at the White House. After extensive discussions, President Ford ordered the final phases of frequent wind to begin. The artillery and rocket strikes had rendered Tan Son Nhut impossible for further evacuations using fixed-wing aircraft. In the following days, U.S. helicopters airlifted around 7,100 American and South Vietnamese military and civilian personnel out of Saigon, many from the embassy rooftop. Navy ships transported over 70,000 South Vietnamese to American vessels in the South China Sea. Tragically, 420 South Vietnamese who had worked for the Americans and had been promised evacuation were left behind. Colonel Harry Summers, an Army officer at the U.S. Embassy, later remarked that this was a shameful day to be an American, and that the embassy evacuation epitomized the Vietnam War writ small. As it had in the broader context, the Americans failed to keep their promises. Once the evacuation ramped up, chaos erupted in the city. Mobs filled the streets, flipping cars, igniting buildings, and looting. Former American homes and offices were primarily targeted by looters who took everything they could grab, including bathroom fixtures. One reporter later described it as an all-out frenzy, with people rifling through drawers, tearing down curtains, emptying refrigerators, and grabbing sheets, blankets, and dishes. An impressive display of rage, frenzy, and joy by those intent on plunder. The North Vietnamese forces advanced steadily toward the heart of the city, facing little resistance, as the Saigon military command had effectively disappeared. Just before the turn of the century, Lieutenant Gen Vinh Loc, the new chief of the Joint General Staff, issued his only order of the day. He cautioned his officers and soldiers against running away like a mouse, assuring them, "From now on, I, along with the commanding generals, will be among you, day and night." Soon after, Locke boarded a helicopter towards the evacuation ships, leaving most other senior commanders behind. A reporter who witnessed the fall of the South Vietnamese armed forces and the civil government in Saigon later reflected, like a puppet cut from its strings, the entire Saigon government was collapsing. There was chaos, no army, and no authority, except for the weapons still wielded by many. Shortly after 5 a.m. on April 30th, Ambassador Martin, carrying the American flag he had taken from his office, left by CH-46 helicopter for the USS Blue Ridge, anchored in the South China Sea. At 10:24, President Dong Van Minh declared the unconditional surrender of the Republic of Vietnam. Almost immediately, South Vietnamese soldiers began shedding their weapons and uniforms, trying to blend into the crowds to escape the victor's wrath. Some chose a different path. One ARVN colonel went to Lam Son Square, home to the memorial for South Vietnamese war heroes. He saluted the large statue of a soldier and took his own life with his pistol. By noon, General Dung's 2nd Corps tanks rolled through the outskirts of Saigon and entered the city unchallenged, followed by trucks full of armed PAVN soldiers. A column of tanks drove down Tong Nhut Avenue toward Independence Palace. The lead tank, number 843, commanded by Major Nguyen Van Hoa, crashed through the palace gates. Other tanks formed a semicircle on the palace grounds, right in front of the steps. One PAVN soldier leaped from his tank, rushed up the steps, and began joyfully waving the blue and red flag with the yellow star of the Provisional Revolutionary Government. Neil Davis, a war correspondent for Reuters, asked for the soldier's name, and he replied, Nguyen Van Thieu. With that ironic twist, the Vietnam War came to a close. There's no question that the South Vietnamese faced a decisive defeat in the battles of 1974 to 75. The United States bears a significant share of the blame for this defeat. Nguyen Van Thieu only agreed to the Paris Accords under pressure from Richard Nixon, who repeatedly assured him that military aid and support would flow to South Vietnam if the North Vietnamese took advantage after the ceasefire. Eager to wrap up peace talks, the U.S. accepted the presence of over 150,000 PVN soldiers in South Vietnam when the ceasefire started. When the North Vietnamese launched their offensive, the U.S. failed to deliver the promised support. This failure dealt a crushing blow to South Vietnamese morale and fighting spirit. Lacking U.S. backing, the South Vietnamese forces disintegrated in just 55 days. Many have questioned whether this defeat was unavoidable. While nothing in war is set in stone, signing the Paris Peace Accords with those enemy troops remaining in South Vietnam clearly set the stage for defeat. One can only speculate what might have happened had the U.S. insisted on the withdrawal of North Vietnamese troops as part of the agreement. Even with the terms of the accords as they were, all was not lost. In 1972, with U.S. support, the South Vietnamese successfully resisted an all-out offensive by 130,000 North Vietnamese troops. It's hard to imagine what could have occurred if the United States had followed through with its promises during the final PAVN offensive in 1974-75. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, leading to catastrophic outcomes for both the Republic of Vietnam, which ceased to exist as a nation, and the United States, which faced its first defeat in war and left its allies behind on the battlefield.